Chapter 25:03. The cultivator who had arrived was none other than the good-looking woman from before. Back then, in order to save this burly cultivator, she had paid a huge price and might have even lost her own self-awareness. That was the woman who was good-looking. When they arrived, the good-looking woman's body was blurry. The outline of her body was sometimes clear and sometimes blurry. It was as if she was formed from a ball of strange light and was constantly vibrating. Countless light spots and streams of light would break away from her body at every moment and gather back into this body under her will. The aura that flowed out of her body was unimaginably powerful. At the very least, compared to the good-looking woman from back then, she was countless times more powerful. Compared to the two balls of light that were blocking the path, this beautiful woman seemed to be 10 times or even 100 times stronger. Following the path, at the source of the path, within the fog, there was nothing but emptiness. The light spots, energy ripples, and auras that were flickering constantly had all disappeared at this moment. When the good-looking woman arrived at the place where the burly cultivator was, figures emerged from the fog one after another. They were the cultivators that had faced off against the two balls of light in the void. However, compared to back then, these cultivators all looked helpless. Even their auras could not compare to back then. It was as if they had suffered an extremely shocking blow and could no longer maintain their peak state. From this, it could be seen that their lives over the past tens of thousands of years were not very pleasant. The beginning cultivator was also among these cultivators. However, compared to the other cultivators, his performance was much better. At the very least, it was not much different from back then. By the time they completely left the fog had become empty again. It was as if the two balls of light that had been fighting had completely disappeared. I didn't expect her to win in the end. A cultivator sighed, as if he was lamenting the vicissitudes of life. It's just that she doesn't seem to be herself anymore. Is this kind of victory really necessary? Another cultivator followed up. To her, perhaps the most important thing isn't what we should be paying attention to, a woman said with a rather complicated expression. At this moment, they were standing at the exit of the fog. Although there were hundreds of people standing on this seemingly small road, they didn't feel crowded at all. On the contrary, it was quite spacious. Everyone had enough space to stand, and they might even be able to do some actions that required a large space. This change did not surprise the cultivators. From the moment they stepped onto this path, they could sense a mysterious and wondrous presence constantly surging into their bodies, making them feel as if they were comprehending the mysteries that they had dreamt about at all times. From this moment onwards, they understood how mysterious this path was. For such a mystical path to appear, it was perfectly normal for the space to change according to the number of people standing here. The reason why they stood here and did not immediately take action and advance along the path seemed to be because their hearts were filled with a sense of wariness and fear towards the good-looking woman. This wariness and fear came from everything that the good-looking woman had done in the void. Even though the good-looking woman did not target them and even treated them like ants, not even glancing at them, just the shock waves from her battle with the two balls of light were enough to make them run for their lives, and they were almost completely exhausted. If it weren't for the fact that they were all fifth tribulation experts and had conceptual immortality, just the terrifying shock waves alone might have been enough to completely wipe them out at this moment. When they slightly recalled how terrifying the woman was, they no longer had the urge to immediately chase after her. Perhaps what that ruler said was right. This kind of cultivation path is indeed wrong. A cultivator with a slightly blurry figure sighed at this moment. This cultivator with a slightly blurry figure was the cultivator who had listened to the path pointed out by the two balls of light that had been shattered and sealed in an unknown number of trillions of worlds. In other words, he was a cultivator who walked the same path as the good-looking woman. Originally, they had already been convinced by the two balls of light and agreed with this path of completely fusing with the embryonic form of the world's light. They had even taken action to complete the first step and roughly fuse with the embryonic form of the world's light. However, after witnessing the changes in the good-looking woman, Their originally firm confidence suddenly became not as firm as before. An indescribable sense of regret suddenly welled up in their hearts. Hearing his words, the cultivators beside him all sighed inwardly. They sighed inwardly not because the cultivator had walked on the wrong path. Instead, they clearly knew that as long as the cultivator had this kind of thought, then, regardless of whether this path was correct or not, then it would be difficult for him to advance even an inch. Since this path was wrong, there was naturally no need to say anything else. Walking on the wrong path and not completely falling into depravity was already considered good luck. How could he hope for more progress? However, even if the other party's judgment was wrong and this path was correct, it was still not a good thing for the cultivator, because he had already begun to doubt the path he had taken. This kind of doubt and distrust was the greatest enemy of cultivation. With this kind of doubt from now on, his path would no longer be stable, and an unstable path would ultimately lead to difficulty in advancing even an inch. However, although they knew this, no one spoke up to remind the cultivator. After all, they all knew that there was no need to remind this at all. How could any cultivator who could come here not know this kind of common sense in cultivation? Since this cultivator knew this and said this, there was clearly only one possibility. That was, even if he knew, he could not change his doubts. This kind of doubt had unknowingly penetrated deep into the depths of his heart and became a mark that could not be erased. Since this was the case, what was the point of saying it or not? The other cultivators who had also completed their path of cultivation showed indescribable regret in their eyes. Obviously, they also doubted their current path and suspected that they had been tricked by the two balls of light. If this was any other time, they would have lost all hope by now. However, at this moment, although these cultivators were regretful, and disappointed, they did not despair. Naturally, this was not because they had any way to change their current path of cultivation and separate themselves from the embryonic light of heaven and earth. In fact, every single one of them had tried billions of times, but the final result was that they were still completely integrated with the embryonic light of heaven and earth and could not be separated. Therefore, it was obvious that they had no way to separate themselves from the light of heaven and earth. The reason why they still had a bit of hope was because right now they were heading towards the final place of fortune. They were heading towards the place of fortune that would bring them endless benefits from the light of heaven and earth. They had no way to separate themselves from the embryonic light of heaven and earth and reverse their own path of cultivation. However, they believed that the final place of fortune could help them. It could help them turn the impossible into the possible during this process. It was this kind of hope that prevented them from falling into complete despair or becoming hysterical. While these cultivators were sighing with emotion, longing, and hesitating at the beginning of the path, the good-looking woman had already arrived beside the burly cultivator. At this moment, her gaze was extremely profound, like the boundless and deep sky. It seemed to hide endless emotions and infinite wisdom, but it also seemed to be empty, without any emotion or wisdom. In short, her eyes no longer bore any resemblance to her original eyes. At this moment, the burly cultivator's eyes trembled, and two explosions came from his eyes. Following these two explosions, his eyes directly exploded and turned into a mist of blood that gushed out from his eyes. After this change, the burly cultivator's body trembled, and he suddenly turned around to face the good-looking woman instead of the pavilion. Then, without waiting for him to say anything, his body went limp and he fell to the ground, falling into a deep sleep. The good-looking woman quietly watched the burly cultivator's change. Her expression did not change at all, and her eyes still seemed profound and empty, as if they contained endless emotions and indifference. She looked at the pavilion, but did not seem to be moved at all. It was as if the pavilion was just an ordinary pavilion. Then, she swept her gaze across the area and saw a path that the sturdy cultivator hadn't discovered even after standing here for thousands of years. It was a path that led downwards. However, for some reason, she did not immediately take action, whether it was stepping into the pavilion or the path. Instead, she just quietly stood there. After a few days, the burly cultivator slowly woke up. After a few days of evolution, the originally empty eye sockets of the burly cultivator had grown 2 new eyes. The 2 eyes were exactly the same as before, and it looked as if time had been reversed. At this moment, the burly cultivator felt like the pavilion was a land of snakes and scorpions. He didn't dare to look at it and only stared at the good-looking woman. He was very familiar with the good-looking woman. The moment he saw her, he knew that she was no longer the same as before. After a long time, he said with a hoarse voice, "What price did you pay?" The woman's expression was cold as she said, "I just completely merged my consciousness with the will of the world." Hearing this, the burly cultivator's body trembled. His eyes were filled with regret as he said, "It was I who harmed you. This was my own choice." The woman was still indifferent. Whether it was her expression or gaze, they did not change at all. From this, it could be seen that although the woman's memories were still there, they were just memories. She was no longer who she used to be. The emotions brought about by those memories, for the current her, were perhaps nothing more than the plot of a movie. The burly cultivator's eyes narrowed as he said, "I will definitely help you get out of this state." The woman's expression was still cold, but her eyes were slightly focused. "In that case, you will be my enemy." Hearing this, the burly cultivator's body trembled. The bitterness on his face became even more intense, but his eyes became even more determined. Naturally, he knew what the woman was trying to say. After all, to restore this woman to her original appearance, it would be equivalent to killing her right now. If this wasn't her enemy, then what was it? However, it is impossible for you to succeed. This pavilion is a relic left behind by a Tao master, and there's even a projection left behind by a Tao master. Right now, you're not qualified to comprehend it at all. With that, the woman turned around and walked toward the fork beside the pavilion. The burly cultivator's eyes narrowed. Only now did he realize that there was a fork beside the pavilion that led down to the depths of the mountain. Although he was extremely curious about this pavilion that was filled with boundless information and even made him lose his ability to think for tens of millions of years, he didn't dare to look at it again. As for the information he received from the pavilion over the past tens of millions of years, he clearly knew that it contained endless truths and mysteries. If he could fully comprehend it, it would bring him endless benefits. It could even improve his cultivation realm by a tremendous amount. However, he couldn't comprehend any of the information at all. It was so much so that the information had become a huge burden on him, and it seemed like his thoughts had become a lot slower because of it. Therefore, at this moment, the burly cultivator began to think about how to cut off the information. Just like Luo Fan back then, of course, he was much stronger than Luo Fan back then, so he quickly thought of a way. The embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth rushed into his body. With a slight tremble, wisps of flowing light continuously dispersed from his body. Chapter 2504. After a while, when the fog of light no longer surged out, the burly cultivator's expression had already returned to the quick-wittedness and profoundness he had before he saw the pavilion. The slight sluggishness and numbness that had always been present had disappeared without a trace. I finally severed the mysteries of the Tao master level. This thought flashed through the burly cultivator's mind. He wanted to take another look at the pavilion, but in the end, his powerful will stopped him. Then, he turned around and walked toward the fork beside the pavilion. As soon as he stepped into the fork, he felt an endless stream of information and mysteries surging towards him. He had truly stepped into the final land of opportunity. This was the land of opportunity that the true saint had prepared for them. Although the good-looking woman had already entered the fork ahead of him, due to the various mysteries here, he could not see her figure at all. Under such circumstances, he could only move forward step by step. At this moment, his fledgling light of heaven and earth appeared involuntarily and floated above his head, accepting the endless information and mysteries with his body. At the same time, It also underwent various subtle and indescribable transformations like his body. It seemed that whether it was him or the fledgling light of heaven and earth, they were constantly improving, gaining, and sublimating. This mysterious and wonderful feeling made the burly cultivator suddenly feel that everything he had done before was worth it. As the burly cultivator stepped into the fork in the path, the many foreign cultivators seemed to have sensed something at the entrance of the path and beyond the mist. All of them suddenly came to a realization. If they went forward now, they would no longer encounter the cultivator that they feared. At this moment, the many cultivators began to calmly advance along the path, as if nothing had happened. In the end, after a few days, they stopped in front of the pavilion one by one. Their minds were drowned by the endless information emitted by the pavilion, and they fell into a sluggish state like statues. None of the cultivators were an exception. One could imagine that although they were already standing in front of the fork, if they wanted to truly step into the fork and accept the final opportunity, it would still take an extremely long time. After all, with the appearance of so many cultivators, if there was no external stimulation, it would probably take them tens of millions of years to wake up. The burly cultivator from before was about the same as them, but it was because of the good-looking woman that he was able to wake up after tens of millions of years. The cultivators in front of him did not have such luck. They could only wait for an outsider to come here in order to be stimulated by an external force. Only then would they be able to truly wake up. And this, obviously, would be a matter for a very, very long time. In the heavenly lake, the strongest human and the exotic beast king had already found the core of the heavenly lake. There aren't many anomalies in the other areas of the Tianu Lake. This is the only place left, the strongest human expert said to the beast king. The human and the exotic beast were originally instinctively hostile towards each other. If they met in the outside world, fighting to the death would be the only outcome for them. However, after staying in the heavenly lake for so many years, there had been so many invisible interactions between them that the enmity between them had gradually been suppressed. As a result, they unknowingly started to cooperate more and more. Finally, at this moment, the two of them could finally completely ignore their instincts and stand together to face the source of the turmoil that caused the entire world to almost fall into doomsday. It should be here. Judging from the surrounding ruins, this location should be the source of that destruction, the exotic beast king said with a buzzing voice. Then let's go. I seem to have sensed a strange undulation from inside. Although it was only for a billionth of an instant, I definitely wouldn't mistake it, the strongest human said at this moment. Hearing this, the exotic beast king was not surprised at all. As an exotic beast king, his senses were even stronger than the strongest human cultivators. Even the strongest human cultivators could sense something. How could not sense it? In fact, compared to the strongest human, the exotic beast king could sense more things, and they were even more complicated. In the perception of the strongest human, it was nothing more than a strange fluctuation. However, he could sense that this undulation contained millions upon millions of even more subtle power undulations. Through these power undulations, he could sense that a terrifying battle that was countless times stronger than he had imagined was taking place there. Not only that, he could even vaguely sense the final outcome of that terrifying battle. That was, one side had won, and the other side had been forced back until there was no more movement. It was precisely because he sensed this that he dared to plot with the strongest human to enter that place. Otherwise, if that place was filled with battlefields, how would he dare to enter unless he was tired of living? However, there was obviously no need for him to tell this to the strongest human. Although their cooperation had deepened, he was still instinctively hostile towards the strongest human being. Under such hostility, perhaps he wouldn't scheme against the other party during their cooperation, but it was impossible for him to be as sincere as a good friend. The strongest human did not sense that the exotic beast king was hiding anything from him. After all, he was rather confident. After the man and the beast came to an agreement, they immediately took action. They were living beings that were born and bred in this world, So the shackles they were subjected to were many times stronger than what foreign cultivators were subjected to. If foreign cultivators wanted to enter the void, they only needed to conform to a certain undulation and directly step into it. However, they were different. Although it was not as difficult for them to step into the void as it was for them to leave this world and enter the chaotic starry sky, it was not as simple as it was for outsiders. They needed to adjust themselves to an extremely subtle state and reduce the shackles they were subjected to as much as possible. They even had to suppress their cultivation realm to the extreme in order to achieve this. However, it took 1,000 years for the man and the beast to complete all the preparations. At this moment, the two of them seemed like ordinary living beings without any cultivation or any other power. If this aura was thrown into a crowd of living beings in the outside world, no one would discover their existence. However, in the core of the heavenly lake, their appearances were extremely conspicuous. After all, this was a heavenly lake with boundless pressure that could completely crush ordinary cultivators. In fact, this heavenly lake was a place where ordinary cultivators had to use all sorts of methods to enter, and it was located in the fog between the two regions. In such a place, the more powerful it was, the more ordinary it was. It was obvious that these existences without any cultivation would not appear here. How could they not be conspicuous and not attract attention when they appeared here? However, to them, everything in the outside world was completely out of their perception. After all, it was not easy to suppress one's strength to reach this state. At the very least, with their strength, this was practically exhausting their mental strength. At this moment, the only thing they could do was follow their plan and rush into the core as soon as possible. They wanted to rush into the strange world that might exist inside. The two of them had already considered everything clearly over the years, so they did not hesitate at all at this moment. They followed the various arrangements they had left behind and pried open the void, revealing a small crack. Then, the man and the beast let out a loud roar and charged straight into the crack. During the process, they seemed to be tied up by some kind of tough rope. They seemed to be exhausting their strength at every moment, and they even felt like they had stimulated their potential violently, exploding with earth-shattering might as they charged into the crack violently. As they charged into the crack, the entire heavenly lake began to churn violently. The cave abodes left behind by the outsiders, which were already extremely dilapidated, instantly crumbled again. As for the humans and beasts that remained outside, they felt all sorts of terrifying powers bombarding their bodies. Most of the living beings were completely destroyed, and only a small portion of the living beings that were further away saw that something was wrong and decisively fled. They were only injured but not destroyed. *T. Something strange is happening here again. Everyone inside is finished. The cultivators cried out in alarm and quickly fled the heavenly lake and the mist. As they fled, the strange phenomenon began to spread, and the entire world fell into chaos. It should be noted that the cultivators that could come here were the group of existences that stood at the highest level in this world. Whether it was humans or beasts, they were all the same. Under such circumstances, everything that existed here was naturally closely related to the order and situation of the entire world. Their sudden deaths were obviously a huge blow to the order of the entire world. At this moment, all the cultivators in this world had different thoughts. Some saw through everything and no longer had any thoughts of fighting for power, so they directly retreated. Some became ambitious and began to jump up and down, trying to seize the empty spots left behind by the experts. Under such circumstances, how could this world not be in chaos, especially when there were outsiders sowing dissension among them, adding more fuel to the fire? As a result, this world became even more chaotic. Naturally, the strongest human expert and the exotic beast king didn't expect the chaos in this area to break out. In fact, even if they had expected it, they no longer cared. This was because when they stepped into the passage, the place they arrived at was not the dangerous and chaotic place that they had imagined. Instead, it was a world that was even more unbelievable and prosperous than the outside world. Or rather, It was a world group. At this moment, they were standing in a place that was originally empty. However, what appeared in front of them was no longer the void. Instead, it was a world that was densely packed like the stars in the universe. It was a world that was boundless and endless. Every part of the world seemed to be even vaster and more mysterious than the world they had been fighting in before they were split into two halves. These worlds are all complete and flawless worlds, the strongest human murmured. His eyes were filled with disbelief and shock. It turned out that the world where the man and beast were fighting was a world with a flaw. They were very clear on this point. In fact, the strongest human of the previous generation had even fought fiercely in order to seize the world that seemed a little complete. In the end, the strongest human had gone missing. And now, the densely packed and endless worlds in front of them were all complete and flawless worlds. How could they not be shocked? How could they not feel that it was unimaginable? Our strength. Suddenly, the exotic Beast King's expression changed. He suddenly felt that the strength that he should have recovered didn't show any signs of recovering at all. He was still in a state where he could not be found at all. At this moment, the strongest human had also noticed this, and his expression changed drastically. If this goes on, we won't be able to live for long. How can this be? Why haven't my strength recovered? He said, his eyes filled with anxiety. The problem lies in this world group. It's precisely because these worlds are complete and flawless that we can't recover the strength that we brought from the flawed worlds. The Beast King said. His speculation made the strongest human cultivator look enlightened. Then, the enlightened immediately turned into despair. Knowing why this was the case was naturally a good thing. However, if he knew the reason and couldn't solve the problem, it would be a sad thing. At this moment, a light flashed in a certain part of the world group. The strongest human expert felt his body being pulled by some kind of indescribable force. In a flash, he had already pierced through the boundless void and entered that side of the world. Following that, the exotic Beast King was also drawn by the other world. It crossed the boundless void and entered the other world. In the blink of an eye, peace was restored. It was as if the man and beast had never appeared before. Chapter 25:05. It was as if there was no longer a balance between the heavens and earth that could stabilize this world and prevent it from going out of control. The chaos of the world no longer had any effect on the strongest human expert and the exotic Beast King. However, for the outsiders who had stepped into this world one after another, the impact was rather huge. The chaos of the world made it more and more dangerous. At the same time, it also gave the outsiders enough opportunities to explore the world more easily and search for the final path of opportunity. In the end, over the next hundreds of thousands of years, the heavenly lake was gradually occupied by the outsiders. It was as if time had flowed backwards, and it returned to the state before the change occurred. However, compared to before, only a few of the outsiders had set up their cave abodes in the heavenly lake and settled down for the time being. Instead, most of them directly entered the void at the center of the heavenly lake, which was the current heavens and earth group. After all, the two terrifying balls of light were no longer obstructing them. Even though there were many heavens and earth in the heavenly lake group, and the passage leading to the next step was hidden in the endless heavens and earth, making it extremely difficult to find, it was much safer than before. As a result, they could naturally leisurely search within the heavenly lake group, and they did not need to make any preparations outside the heavenly lake group. However, after the heavenly lake group was formed, it had formed all sorts of strange characteristics. They had a strange pulling force on all existences that stepped into the heavenly lake group. This pulling force made it difficult for the cultivators to stay outside the heavenly lake group. They could only move between the heavenly lake group and search for the truth of the heavenly lake group with great difficulty, and then search for the passage that led to the next trial, because they did not know what the heavenly lake group originally looked like. They did not know that the passage was between the heavenly lake group and not within the heavenly lake group. As such, this kind of search was like trying to fish from a tree, and it could be considered a waste of time. Over millions of years, not a single outsider had been able to find the final passage. On the contrary, in the process of constantly moving between heaven and earth, they sensed the various subtle traces left behind by the battle between the good-looking woman and the two balls of light, and they experienced the various subtle principles contained within. Through these principles, each of them gained a lot. There were even some who obtained crucial information and came into contact with the path that the two balls of light wanted to lead the cultivators onto, a path that allowed them to completely merge with the embryonic form of the world's light. However, because they had only come into contact with it subconsciously and did not have any seniors guiding them, those cultivators did not change their path of cultivation. Moreover, the possibility of them truly changing their path of cultivation was quite small. After all, this was the path of cultivation. It was the path they had cultivated for their entire lives, and the path they had persevered on. If it was not absolutely necessary, if they were not sure that they could gain enough benefits and have a brighter future by changing their cultivation path, how could they change their cultivation path so easily? Under such circumstances, the situation in this group gradually fell into a stalemate. The passageway was clearly already open somewhere in this group of heavens and earth, but no cultivator could discover it and know that it was the path to the next trial. While the situation in this side of the world fell into a stalemate on the continent of the 999-story high tower, the Tao ancestor had advanced another few dozen levels and had now completed distorting the flow of time on the 300th level. The flow of time on the 300th level had also accelerated to the speed of the first 299 levels, turning the first 300 levels into the most powerful holy land for native cultivators to cultivate. His own cultivation realm had unknowingly risen to the peak of the tribulation realm, and he had come into contact with the bottleneck between the tribulation realm and the second tribulation realm. If it was Luo Fan, this was already a state that could trigger the Great Tribulation. For the cultivators on the path of becoming a Tao Master, this was already qualified to pursue the second tribulation realm. However, at this moment, for the Tao ancestor, this almost meant that, in his understanding, he had already reached the end of his path. The tribulation realm was already an incredible realm for him, and he was constantly shocked by the fact that he could rise to this level, and he was even more shocked by the strength of the outsiders. With such a mentality, the peak of the tribulation realm was already a peak that was difficult for him to break through, and he even thought that it was the limit of his potential. Even though he clearly knew that the outsider was still many times stronger than him and could still easily crush millions of him, he didn't know which direction he should break through to. He didn't know which aspect he should break through in, which aspect he should ascend to. If such a problem was elsewhere, he would definitely doubt whether he had really reached the end, and he might even feel despair and give up on himself. However, this was not any other place. This was the continent of the 999-story high tower that had guided him to this current realm. Facing such a continent, he clearly knew that the limits and limits of his cognition were nothing more than an insignificant threshold compared to the 999 floors of the high tower continent. As long as he continued to walk according to the arrangements of this continent, he would definitely be able to improve further, and he would definitely be able to break through this seemingly unshakable bottleneck. Faced with such a situation, the Tao ancestor did not even inform the many disciples who had almost reached the same level as him. After stabilizing his own realm, he turned around and sneaked into the next level. Only the tens of thousands of dumbfounded disciples were left staring blankly at their own teacher. This was because the Tao ancestor only completed the resonance with the continent and slightly stabilized his realm before leaving. Therefore, the time that he had experienced was billions of times less than the time that his disciples had experienced. As a result, every time he sought to resonate with the continent on the next level, his disciples would have already comprehended all the profound principles and mysteries contained in the previous level's terrifying flow of time. Then, they would break through the barrier of the previous level and arrive on the same level as the Tao ancestor. The longer the Tao ancestor resonated with the continent, the more such disciples there would be. Usually, in the end, when the Tao ancestor completed the task of resonating with the continent on that level. Such disciples would reach the level of all the disciples. The entire situation was as if the Tao ancestor was the end of a thread, and his disciples were a ball of thread connected to the end of the thread. In the beginning, the end of the thread would first go deep into the next level, and then it would start to pull bit by bit until the entire ball of thread was pulled into the next level. Then, the thread would wait for a while before it started to sink again, and the process would repeat itself. This cycle seemed to last forever. It's so hard to comprehend. When the Tao ancestor stepped into the 301st level, he was shocked, and there seemed to be surprise and helplessness surging from the bottom of his heart. The pleasant surprise naturally came from the profound truths and mysteries contained within the 301st layer. Compared to what he felt, it was countless times more profound. It gave him the opportunity to use these truths and mysteries to break through the final bottleneck and increase his cultivation realm once again. However, he felt helpless because the principles and mysteries that he could not understand were too complicated. They were so complicated that he could not understand them now. This kind of incomprehensibility made it much more difficult for him to completely comprehend these profound truths and mysteries than the previous 300 levels. Under such difficulty, if he wanted to obtain the reward he wanted, not only would the time he would need to spend would be much more difficult than any of the previous 300 levels, he would also need to spend countless times more energy than before to achieve his goal. It was precisely because of this that he looked so complicated at this time. Just when the Tao ancestor stepped into the 301st level, in a mysterious place in the forbidden area, Luo Fan suddenly showed a faint smile on his face. Everything is going quite well. There should be no problem in replacing the second level of the Tao Master's Path. At the same time, such a thought flashed in his mind. At this time, the Tao ancestor had not yet resonated with the 301st level, so he could not truly complete the transformation of his realm and break through the shackles of the first level of the Tao Master's Path. However, what kind of existence was Luo Fan? At a glance, he could already see from the subtle interaction between the Tao ancestor and that level that it was not a problem for the Tao ancestor to break through. Once he could break through, it was obviously equivalent to Luo Fan wanting to replace the Tao Master's Path with the help of the 999 levels of the High Tower. At least he had succeeded in reaching the second level. With that thought, Luo Fan only felt inexplicably carefree. Faintly, there seemed to be an unconcealable feeling gushing out from the depths of his heart, making him feel relaxed and happy. At the same time, his cultivation realm seemed to have made subtle progress. The time of the seventh tribulation seemed to have been brought forward by millions of years again. Feeling all kinds of subtle changes in his body and mind, Luo Fan looked down at the 999 levels of the High Tower. Following the path of the foreign cultivators, he quickly sent his perception into that side of the world, then into that group of heavens and earth, through the passage, into that mysterious path, and then into the final fork that was completely occupied by endless information and mysteries. The reason he was able to accomplish this was naturally because those outsiders had comprehended the numerous principles and profundities he'd set up, and they'd charged through the various tests he'd set up in order to arrive at the place of fortune at the depths of the divine realm. Although there was no special aura left on these outsiders, no imprint, no hidden divine sense, no hidden ideas, and so on. However, as long as these cultivators had experienced the tests set by Luo Fan and comprehended the principles and mysteries he had left, they would naturally form some kind of subtle connection with him. This subtle connection would not be of much use to ordinary cultivators. But for an existence like Luo Fan, it was enough for him to use all kinds of means. For example, he'd relied on this connection to lead his senses to the final place of fortune that his senses were unable to reach. She has almost completely given up on her own consciousness and completely fused with the embryonic form of the world's light. With a single glance, he could see the state of the good-looking woman who had already turned into the amalgamation of information and mysteries in the form of the world's light. He could not help but sigh inwardly. That good-looking woman's choice meant that she no longer had any possibility of transcending. In fact, if she did not deal with it well, she might not even be able to recover. However, it was also because of this state that the woman's ability to accept the endless information and mysteries around her was far greater than ordinary cultivators. It was also because of this that she was able to advance so quickly on this path. Now, she was actually almost at the end of it. In contrast, although the burly cultivator was also quite extraordinary, he was far inferior to her. Now, he was still wriggling with difficulty near the entrance of the fork in the path. As for the cultivators standing in front of the pavilion, who seemed to have turned into statues, their performances were far inferior compared to the burly cultivator. It's a pity that she missed her last chance. At this moment, Luo Fan, who had sensed something, could not help but sigh. However, he suddenly realized that the beautiful woman had broken through the limit of her body, being able to receive the information and profundities, causing her body and mind to completely transform into a ball of light. She directly received the boundless information and profundities as the light of the world, and she absorbed all the information and profundities that were beneficial to her. This also meant that her body and mind could no longer receive the support of the boundless information and mysteries around her. She could no longer rely on the boundless information and mysteries around her to continue improving. The originally faint possibility of suppressing the embryonic form of the light of the world and regaining her consciousness had been completely severed. This was something that could not be changed as the amount of information and mysteries that the light of the world could accept increased. Chapter 2506. The good-looking woman's figure was getting closer and closer to the two balls of light that blocked the void. Moreover, her body gradually released a mysterious aura that belonged to the light of heaven and earth. It was as if she had turned into the true light of heaven and earth. Amidst such changes, the endless information and mysteries around her constantly surged into her body and fused with it. Compared to before, the speed of this fusion was much faster. The speed at which she approached the information and mysteries in the center that had turned into the light of heaven and earth also increased. It could be predicted that in 1,000 years at most, she would truly immerse herself in the information and mysteries. She would completely grasp everything in it and obtain an unimaginable sublimation. Of course, in Luo Fan's opinion, that was also completely stepping out of the abyss. When the path was close to the beginning, the burly cultivator was trudging with difficulty. The endless information and mysteries around him were like endless waves that kept crashing into his body. He had no choice but to use all his strength to resist it to prevent himself from being pushed back by the waves. Of course, during this process, he could also obtain endless benefits at all times. He could feel that his body and the light of heaven and earth received some indescribable truth and mysteries, allowing both of them to continuously sublimate at the same time. Based on this speed, it could be predicted that 1,000 years would not be enough for him to advance a few kilometers. In other words, when the good-looking woman stepped into the information and mysteries in the center that seemed like the light of heaven and earth, the burly cultivator would not be able to reach the deepest part no matter what. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. Looks like they can't change their current relationship in the end. Although the relationship between the burly man and the good-looking woman was not made clear, it was obvious what they were thinking. If not for this, how could they have sacrificed so much for each other? However, it was a pity that if they missed it, it would be forever. They did not make it clear before, but they had lost the chance to do so forever. Sighing, Luo Fan withdrew his senses and once again immersed himself in cultivation. Time passed by, and before he knew it, 1,000 years had passed. On this day, a strange fluctuation suddenly leaked out from the deepest part of the 999-story tower. It stirred up the entire forbidden area, causing the endless light in the forbidden area to instantly become chaotic. The chaos instantly caused a safe passageway into the forbidden area that the cultivators outside had spent so many years exploring to suddenly become a different path. Several cultivators who were carefully advancing along the path were extremely unlucky to be directly sucked into the terrifying light that was thousands of times more violent than before. They completely lost control of themselves and could only passively endure the frenzied erosion of the endless light around them. These cultivators who had not condensed the light of heaven and earth were extremely weak in the forbidden area. Even if they unleashed all of their powers and used all of the methods they could think of, in the end, they could only watch helplessly as the boundless light around them melted, disintegrated, devoured, and digested their bodies. It could be predicted that if there were no accidents, these cultivators would be completely digested. At this moment, a ray of the light of heaven and earth shot out from outside the 999-story tower. It swept outwards and found these unlucky cultivators. It wrapped them up and sent them out of the forbidden area, freeing them from the fate of being devoured and disintegrated by the endless light around them. This method was far beyond what a cultivator who possessed the light of heaven and earth should be able to do. Even a cultivator who had completely condensed the light of heaven and earth would not be able to do this. Only a powerful cultivator who had reached a certain level of perfection in the light of heaven and earth would have the confidence to do this. Fellow Taoist, if you always use the authority given to you by the ruler to do this, you will one day make the ruler unhappy. In the city outside the continent of the 999-story pagoda, a cultivator sighed to another cultivator. The other person was none other than Taoist Master Zhongde. In other words, he was the disciple of the Tao sovereign who had established a friendship with Luo Fan and was given some special authority by Luo Fan in the forbidden area. Taoist Master Zhongde sighed and said, "Perhaps, but I really can't bear to see these fellow Taoists' achievements, which they painstakingly cultivated for billions of years, disappear so easily." It was clear that the one who had helped those cultivators and sent them out of the forbidden area was Taoist Master Zhongde. The reason why Taoist Master Zhongde was able to accomplish such an achievement with the strength of the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth was because of the special authority granted to him by Luo Fan in this forbidden area. The cultivator who had advised Taoist Master Zhongde couldn't help but sigh and say, "Fellow Taoist, it won't do if you keep doing this. This land of opportunity has existed for so long, and it's hard to say how much longer it will last. It's really irrational for fellow Taoist to spend most of his time outside instead of inside the land of opportunity." Taoist Master Zhongde smiled bitterly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you've advised me countless times. I know you have good intentions, but my personality has long been set in stone. I can't change it no matter what I say." His good friend smiled helplessly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you've advised me countless times." He naturally knew Taoist Master Zhongde's personality very well. In fact, if it wasn't for Taoist Master Zhongde's character, how could he, as an eccentric cultivator, as someone who had only a handful of friends over the years, establish such a friendship with Taoist Master Zhongde in such a short period of time? However, fellow Taoist doesn't need to worry. My cultivation hasn't regressed because of this. On the contrary, I've made great progress. Perhaps this is my cultivation. Taoist Master Zhongde looked at his good friend and smiled. Instead, he comforted his good friend. The cultivator smiled even more bitterly when he heard this. Which cultivator didn't make progress in this land of opportunity? Even the worst cultivator, the one with the least comprehension, had a speed of progress much higher than Taoist Master Zhongde. Under such circumstances, Taoist Master Zhongde's words could only have a simple comforting effect. It could be said that if it weren't for his special authority in this forbidden area, Taoist Master Zhongde would have faded into the crowd and wouldn't have his current status at this time. A cultivator suddenly came to see Taoist Master Zhongde. Taoist Master Zhongde's good friend frowned and felt a burst of displeasure in his heart. This naturally wasn't because someone came to disturb his time alone with Taoist Master Zhongde. Rather, it was because he clearly knew that the other cultivators came to find Taoist Master Zhongde for nothing more than his help. When he wanted to help, he naturally wished that Taoist Master Zhongde was overly enthusiastic and would do his best to help a stranger, even at the cost of his own life. But now that his relationship with Taoist Master Zhongde was different, his mentality naturally changed along with it. He wished that Taoist Master Zhongde was incomparably selfish and completely ignored the help of other strangers. However, although he was unhappy in his heart, there was nothing he could do, because the cultivator here didn't come to see him, but to see Taoist Master Zhongde, and it was obviously impossible for Taoist Master Zhongde to not see such a cultivator. Sure enough, Taoist Master Zhongde was very friendly and invited the cultivator who came to see him in, and very gently asked the other party's purpose. Things really were as Taoist Master Zhongde's good friend thought. That cultivator indeed came to ask for help. The cultivator was very ashamed and said, "This time, I shamelessly came because I was forced to. If there was any other way, I wouldn't have shamelessly come to ask for Tao Brother's help." Taoist Master Zhongde said without hesitation, "Why does Tao Brother say this? You and I are both people who seek the Tao, so we should help each other. If Tao Brother has any problems, please say it. As long as I can do it, I won't refuse." I knew it would be like this. Taoist Master Zhongde's good friend sighed in his heart. The cultivator who came to ask for help had a face full of gratitude and said, "Thank you, Tao Brother. This is definitely a piece of cake for you, fellow Taoist." Taoist Master Zhongde just smiled and said, "Please speak." That cultivator then told the matter he wanted to ask for help. It turned out that this cultivator was a vagrant cultivator. He was also a vagrant cultivator who had condensed the complete light of the world. He had entered this forbidden area for hundreds of millions of years. For such a cultivator, this forbidden area was not a place for him to cultivate. After all, this place was most suitable for cultivators who had condensed the embryonic form of the world's light, but hadn't condensed it into true light of the world. For cultivators who had already condensed the complete light of the world, the laws and mysteries of this forbidden area weren't enough to satisfy them. At the very least, compared to the other forbidden grounds and strange cultivation grounds on the 5th level, the principles and profundities of this forbidden ground were still a little lacking. Under these circumstances, this cultivator had stayed in this forbidden area for hundreds of millions of years. This clearly wasn't for cultivation. The reason he came here was to find his son, a cultivator who had condensed the embryonic form of the world's light and was also a 5th tribulation cultivator. His son had entered this forbidden area billions of years ago, and since then, there had been no news of him, and he had completely disappeared. If it wasn't for the connection between him and his son that he knew that his son was still alive and was still in this forbidden area, he might have thought that his son had died. But over the past hundreds of millions of years, he had practically searched every single region in the forbidden grounds, and he had even searched some places thousands of times. He felt that there wasn't a single place in the forbidden grounds that he hadn't searched. However, he still couldn't find his son. His connection with his son was still the same as hundreds of millions of years ago. There was no deterioration, but there was no improvement either. As such, the cultivator was naturally quite anxious. He finally couldn't help but ask for help from Taoist Master Zhongde, who had special authority in this forbidden area. When Taoist Master Zhongde heard this, he agreed without hesitation. He expressed that he would do his best to help this cultivator find his son. The cultivator was overjoyed and quickly bowed to thank Taoist Master Zhongde. "Thank you, Taoist Master Zhongde. Whether I can find him or not, I will remember Taoist Master Zhongde's great kindness for the rest of my life." Taoist Master Zhongde didn't say anything else. He had the cultivator wait in the cave abode for a while before he left the cave abode. He began to head to the places in the forbidden area that he couldn't explore from here. He went to the forbidden areas within the forbidden area, or the places that were completely sealed and isolated from the outside, to explore the situation inside. He wanted to find the location of his son that the cultivator told him about. Compared to before, this forbidden area had become even more complicated. There were many special places that the outside world couldn't explore, but there were hundreds of times more than before. As such, even though Taoist Master Zhonda had special authority and could easily explore places that other cultivators couldn't, it took him hundreds of years to clearly explore these special places and return his cave abode. When the cultivator saw Taoist Master Zhonda, his face was filled with anticipation. He asked, "Did Taoist Master Zhonda find him?" Taoist Master Zhonda had an ashamed expression. "I've already explored almost every possible place, but I couldn't find fellow Taoist Master Zhonda's son." Hearing this, the cultivator's eyes dimmed, and he bitterly smiled. "I still couldn't find him, but I still have to thank fellow Taoist Master for wasting hundreds of years." Taoist Master Zhonda shook his head with shame. "It's only a few hundred years. It's just a blink of an eye. It's just that I wasn't able to help fellow Taoist. I'm truly ashamed." Even though the cultivator was anxious, he couldn't help but admire Taoist Master Zhonda's demeanor. After comforting him for a while, he prepared to leave. Just as he was about to leave, Taoist Master Zhonda's good friend suddenly said, "Just now, fellow Taoist said almost." When the cultivator heard this, he suddenly paused. Then his eyes lit up as he looked at Taoist Master Zhonda. Taoist Master Zhonda said, "Indeed, almost. There are 2 other locations that I haven't explored." Could it be? The cultivator's heartbeat suddenly sped up, and he hesitated. "That's right. It is where the ruler is in." As he spoke, Taoist Master Zhonda pointed. That direction happened to be where the 999 floors of the tall pagoda was located. Seeing that direction, the cultivator's eyes lit up, and he couldn't help but slap his own face. Ferocious power surged out and ruthlessly smashed into his head. In an instant, there was a loud bang, and his head was completely smashed by this slap. It took a long time for the head to recover, directly smashing his own head. Such a violent method was enough to show just how regretful he was. Chapter 2507. Although Taoist Master Zhonda had been given special authority by Luo Fan in this forbidden area, it was only a little bit of authority that Luo Fan had casually given him. It was already extremely rare for him to be able to explore most of the dangerous places. So how could he have the same effect on the land of opportunity left by the true sage at the bottom of the 999-story pagoda continent? Therefore, since Taoist Master Zhonda could not find the location of the cultivator's son, the land of opportunity was obviously the most likely. After receiving Taoist Master Zhonda's hint, the cultivator instantly understood this point. In the past, he might have thought that his son would be there. However, it was just a thought after all, and he quickly overthrew it. After all, it was a land of opportunity that had only appeared in the past tens of millions of years. No matter how he looked at it, the possibility of his son, who had been missing for trillions of years, appearing there was really very small. With that in mind, he would naturally overturn his previous suspicions and believe that his son was not among them. However, the situation was different this time. This time, he had already received confirmation from Taoist Master Zhonda that his son was not in the entire forbidden area, except for this place in front of him and the ruler. In this case, the land of opportunity in front of him was obviously the most likely place where his son went missing. As for why this land of opportunity appeared at a different time from the time when his son went missing, he just needed to think a little to figure it out. Although the land of opportunity had only recently been made public, it did not mean that it did not exist before it was made public. Perhaps the land of fortuitous encounter had existed before this, but it had been hidden so that no one could discover it. Most importantly, by eliminating other places, even if this place was impossible, it was already the only option. This cultivator did not enter this forbidden area for this land of opportunity. Therefore, even though he had been here for many years, he had never entered the 999-story pagoda continent. Although he had heard a lot of information about it from other cultivators, he had never personally entered it. This time, it was his first time stepping into the pagoda continent. Because his real goal was to find his son, he wasn't too obsessed with challenging the trials. After entering the continent of the Spire, he had spent as much time as he could on each floor to sense every location, carefully searching for things, presences, and other subtle presences that might be related to his son. Fortunately, the flow of time in the first 300-plus levels had already been accelerated. Compared to the outside world, it was already hundreds of millions of times faster. This gave him enough time to slowly walk through the entire continent and sense all the strange and dangerous places hidden in the continent. This method did not allow him to find his own son. However, the flowers do not bloom if you have the heart to pick them, and the willow grows shade when you have no intention to do so. Although he did not set his goal on challenging the levels one after another, his action of exploring every inch of the continent, every inch of the ocean, every bit of the void, and exploring every strange place, cultivation place, and adventure place gave him an extremely deep understanding of the various preparations, opportunities, and tests that Luo Fan had left on the various continents. This understanding made the process of him passing through the levels many times smoother than other foreign cultivators. Almost every level went smoothly, and he passed through the passage between this continent and the next level and entered the next level. In his own opinion, he seemed to have spent billions of years to reach the 300th level and the place where the Tao ancestor was resonating with. However, in reality, in the eyes of the outside world, he had passed through more than 300 levels in just a few dozen days, directly surpassing the limit of the time acceleration. However, this was already the end. Next, it was obvious that this kind of short-term breakthrough could no longer continue. After all, the effect of time acceleration could only be obtained after the Tao ancestor completed the resonance. If that's the case, it's really a waste of time. On this day, the cultivator arrived near the Tao ancestor, feeling displeased. He had dared to waste time like that before because he knew about the effect of time acceleration. If not for the effect of time acceleration, he would have sped up no matter what. After all, every day that passed meant that the life and death of his son would be in a state of uncertainty for another day. Perhaps I should think of a way to help him. The cultivator looked at the Tao ancestor, and such a thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, he could come here and see the Tao ancestor, but the Tao ancestor did not stop him because the Tao ancestor did not notice his existence. Otherwise, as a foreign cultivator, he would naturally have a conflict with the Tao ancestor. Even if he did not take it to heart, the Tao ancestor would definitely not let his guard down against him. In this way, it was naturally impossible for the Tao ancestor to watch the cultivator approach. As for why the Tao ancestor did not notice his existence, the reason was even more simple. Although this cultivator didn't absorb the profound truths and mysteries contained in the first 300 layers, he was still a fifth tribulation overlord after all. As a fifth tribulation powerhouse, he was born to stand above the profound truths and mysteries contained in these continents. Adding on to the fact that he had practically swept through every single inch of space in the 300-plus layers, he had swept through every single special spot. In this way, even if he didn't comprehend it in depth, he could faintly understand the profound principles and profundities contained in the layers. On this continent, where the Tao ancestor had yet to resonate with him, he could also do the same. In this way, with the help of the profound truths and mysteries contained in this continent, it was really normal for the cultivator to be able to do this. According to legend, the 999 levels of the pagoda contain the effect of replacing the path of Tao venerables and can nurture native creatures into powerhouses like us. If that's the case for the so-called Tao ancestor in front of me, the difficulty that shackles him should be that he does not have a complete concept of the realms of outsiders like us. The cultivator thought to himself, but he already knew how to help the so-called Tao ancestor. No matter what, this cultivator was a fifth tribulation powerhouse, and it went without saying that his knowledge was vast and his senses were sharp. He only needed to observe the so-called Tao ancestor to understand which barrier he was stuck at. According to his calculations, this barrier would not be too difficult to break through. As long as he comprehended the key, he would immediately be able to break through. The reason why this so-called Tao ancestor was stuck in this state was because he could not comprehend the crux of it. If this situation continued, it was possible that he would not be able to break through for hundreds of millions of years. Obviously, this cultivator would not wait for hundreds of millions of years for him to break through. Immediately, his heart stirred, and in a flash, he had already turned into a stream of light and rushed towards the so-called Tao ancestor. Although he could use the profound truths and mysteries contained in this continent to deceive the Tao ancestors' senses to a certain extent, this kind of deceiving had its limits. However, this kind of deceiving ultimately had a limit. Approaching the Tao ancestor and just observing without any action could indeed make the Tao ancestor not sense it. However, even if the Tao ancestor was deceived by the profound principles and mysteries of this continent, his life instincts would make him instantly wake up and realize that something was wrong when he dashed towards the Tao ancestor in such a carefree and unrestrained manner. At this moment, the Tao ancestor opened his eyes wide, and two incomparably dazzling rays of light shot out from his eyes. The void was slightly distorted under this light, and it felt as if a terrifying power was being released from it. The Tao ancestor shouted angrily, "Who is it?" In an instant, the light disappeared, and he had already discovered the cultivator who had turned into a ray of light and was rushing towards him. He was instantly enraged, and he raised his hand to grab the light. His strength as a peak stage calamity cultivator was displayed to the fullest. With this grab, it was as if the world had turned upside down. The entire continent seemed to have gathered all the power in this instant, and it was under his control as it ruthlessly crushed towards the light. At this moment, the cultivator felt the void around him change. The extremely short distance between him and the Tao ancestor seemed to have increased by trillions of times in an instant. It was as if in the blink of an eye, the two of them had been completely separated by two different worlds. Immediately after, a huge palm that covered the sky descended from the sky and grabbed towards him. The size of the palm was secondary. More importantly, it contained endless power. Under this palm, he seemed to have turned from an incomparably powerful fifth tribulation cultivator into a baby who couldn't even stand on his own. He could only watch helplessly as the palm that blotted out the sky and covered the sun ruthlessly pinched him. Not bad. Seeing this scene, the cultivator only secretly praised in his heart, but there was not much panic on his face. Although the technique used by the cultivator in front of him was not weak, it was only not weak. Compared to the various techniques that he had mastered, this kind of technique was not enough to pose a threat to him. At this moment, he did not even take any action. The light that his body had turned into slightly twisted, and there were threads of light that instantly weaved into countless strange runes. As the rune appeared, the ray of light he had transformed into flashed through the void, piercing through the distance between the Tao ancestor and the Tao ancestor that seemed to be separated by a world, and pierced into the center of the Tao ancestor's eyebrows. Damn it! The Tao ancestor instantly turned pale with fright. Just as he was about to take action to expel the existence that had pierced into his forehead, he suddenly discovered that his vision had blurred, and he had directly arrived at a strange world. Immediately after, he seemed to have turned into a strange creature, and he was currently in an incomparably vast world. "Where is this?" he murmured, finding it difficult to understand. This world was so vast that it had exceeded his imagination. Even in his dreams, he could not imagine that such a vast world existed apart from its vastness. This world also contained mysteries that surpassed all the worlds he had seen before. Even the aura of the world seemed to be formed from countless auras that he had sensed, and he understood that even if he used his entire life on it, he would not be able to comprehend all of them. As for the shape of the mountains and rivers, the shape of the clouds and the sky, the terrain of the ground, the charm of the plants, and even the shapes of the living beings, all of them allowed him to sense the extremely deep resources hidden behind them. He knew that they were absolutely not formed by ordinary means. Instead, they had a boundlessly long history and all sorts of unimaginable factors had interacted with each other to form these various shapes. This is the world that the outsiders live in. This is the world that I entered after breaking through the layers of continents. An unbelievable conjecture suddenly flashed through the Tao ancestor's mind, and he could not help but become agitated. At this moment, his body suddenly began to move involuntarily. Only then did he realize that it was not his real self here, but another existence that he was completely unfamiliar with. He had merely attached his consciousness to that existence and observed everything that that existence had experienced from the perspective of a bystander. As he watched, the existence that it had attached to was risking its life in this incomparably vast world. Countless incredible and mysterious scenes appeared in front of him, including all kinds of unimaginable cultivation paths, all kinds of unimaginable creatures, and even the powerful disciples of the Tao Master. They were all constantly seen by him in this process. There were even a few times when he encountered some powerful existences that claimed to be the disciples of the Tao Master. He felt that those powerful existences seemed to have detected his existence through some unimaginable means. For the Tao ancestor, who had gradually come to understand his situation, this simply overturned his worldview. After all, the more he saw, the more he understood that he was probably reading the memories of the powerful existence that he had attached to. In other words, everything that he had encountered had been experienced by that powerful existence. In this way, the existences that he had encountered were obviously, to a certain extent, fake existences. However, such a fake existence was actually able to discover him. How could he not be shocked? How could he not feel that his worldview had been overturned? Chapter 25:08. When the Tao ancestor came back to his senses, he found that there was a cultivator standing quietly in front of him. This cultivator was middle-aged, and he looked distressed, as if he had accumulated endless suffering in his heart. When people saw him, they would naturally feel all kinds of inexplicable sadness. Countless thoughts appeared in the Tao ancestor's mind at that moment, allowing him to instantly understand what had happened just now. He could not help but say, with a complicated expression, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist. However, I don't know why you're doing this." Through the experiences of the characters in his memories just now, he had seen another world and learned about countless things that he did not know before. Or perhaps it should be said that he had occasionally comprehended all kinds of cultivation knowledge, but it was still blurry, not a concept, and not a system. With these various experiences, he had already understood the direction he was moving forward in, and he knew what he was missing when he could not break through. Although this was not enough for him to break through immediately and become a second tribulation expert, he had broken through the biggest bottleneck. As long as he had enough time, he would definitely be able to break through. This kind of help was already considered favor. And to be able to give him such enlightenment, this distressed middle-aged man was obviously an outsider. As an outsider, giving him such kindness definitely wasn't out of kindness. Instead, it could only be because he had something to ask of him. It was because of these various thoughts that the Tao ancestor asked such a question at this time. Hearing this, the distressed middle-aged man sighed and said, "I just can't wait. I only hope that you can break through as soon as possible and distort the flow of time as soon as possible." A look of hesitation appeared on the Tao ancestor's face. He seemed to have come to a sudden realization, but he was also inexplicably at a loss. After all, for outsiders, wasn't time almost meaningless? Since it was meaningless, then what was the meaning of the continent's time distortion to them? Why would they give their own cultivation experience to native cultivators like them for this purpose? The distressed middle-aged man did not stay there for long. After saying that, he took a deep look at the Tao ancestor, and his figure flashed, disappearing without a trace. This time, the Tao ancestor saw traces, but it was not like before, where he could not see any traces at all. However, it was only a trace, and he knew how he left. As for where he went, he was still lacking a lot. No matter what, this is a good thing for me. This is also a good thing for all the native cultivators. Very soon, the Tao ancestor gathered his thoughts and focused all his attention on his own cultivation. He once again began to comprehend the profound truths and mysteries contained in this layer of land. After gaining a clear sense of direction, the Dao Father's cultivation speed increased dramatically. In just a few thousand years, it had completed resonating with this continent. In an instant, the river of time appeared in the sky and split into two, causing the flow of time in this continent to wildly distort. Following that, endless truths and mysteries were continuously injected into his heart, merging with his body and mind. With all these changes, the Tao ancestor's cultivation finally broke through the invisible shackles and stepped into the level of a second tribulation expert. As a result, his strength had increased by tens of thousands of times. An earth-shattering aura soared into the sky and spread throughout the 999 floors of the tower. Whether it was in places where time had been distorted or not, everyone could feel this terrifying aura that was tens of thousands of times stronger than a tribulation cultivator. What is this? All of the native cultivators and foreign cultivators were in an indescribable state of shock at this moment. For the native cultivators, this shock was needless to say. They immediately discovered that the source of this aura was their Tao ancestor, the most powerful existence among native cultivators like them. At this time, the terrifying aura he released had already subverted their understanding and completely exceeded the limits of their imagination. They had never thought that a native cultivator could actually reach such a terrifying level. As for the foreign cultivators, they were naturally not too shocked by the power of a second tribulation expert. However, the person and the place where this level of power appeared was what shocked them the most. Whether it was a person or a place, the appearance of this kind of power at this time had already subverted their worldview. As a native cultivator, he did not have the cultivation environment of a town master, nor did he have the almost infinite time that they had, yet he could actually advance to the level of a second tribulation expert. How could they accept this? After all, this meant that the existence who created this continent with 999 floors was even comparable to a town master in some aspects. And this place was a continent with 999 floors that had a great suppression on the strength of all the cultivators. Here, even the continent with the weakest suppression on the cultivator's strength could at most allow the cultivators to have the strength close to the level of a tribulation expert. But now, this native cultivator had obtained the strength of a second tribulation cultivator in one of the 999 floors of the tower. This made it even more difficult for them to calm down. For a time, every floor of this continent became extremely lively at this time. All kinds of noisy thoughts were shuttling around. Many cultivators tried their best to inquire about what was going on and discuss what would happen if this continued. However, all of this was nothing to the distressed middle-aged man. Feeling this aura and comparing it with the flow of time on other floors, he knew that his plan had succeeded. As expected, the flow of time on this level had been accelerated to an extreme degree. Finally, I have enough time. At this moment, he let out a long breath, and the distress on his face dissipated a little. Although thousands of years had passed, he was still on the continent where the Tao ancestor was. Moreover, the exploration of this continent was just the beginning. It would probably take several million years before they could truly explore this layer of the continent. And this was at the very least. With this thought in mind, the distressed middle-aged man once again immersed himself in the exploration of this continent. Even though the flow of time had been accelerated a lot, it was still constantly passing. If he wasted too much time, it would ultimately be dangerous for his son. This time, the Tao ancestor did not leave the continent after stabilizing his realm like he had done before. Instead, he had stayed on this continent for hundreds of millions of years. To other continents that had not accelerated the flow of time, this period of time was only equivalent to a few years, but to him, it was still a time he could afford to waste. Of course, from the perspective of speeding up the flow of time on each continent, this was indeed a waste of time. However, from the perspective of his fundamental goal, which was to make the native cultivator stronger, this choice was definitely not a waste of time. This was because what he had been doing for hundreds of millions of years was not being in a daze, nor was he cultivating on his own. Instead, he was preaching to the native cultivators. The content of his sermon was naturally what he had comprehended from the distressed, middle-aged man's memories. It was about the prospects of cultivation, the direction of cultivation, and even some common sense of cultivation that surpassed the 999 floors of the pagoda. After all, he had the distressed, middle-aged man's memories to guide him, but other cultivators did not. If those cultivators were allowed to explore and explore on their own, perhaps they would be able to break through in the end. However, he might not be able to do it by the time he reached the 999th floor of the spire. In fact, it was more likely that even if they wasted so much time, they would not be able to comprehend anything and would not be able to break through the bottleneck that he had previously encountered under such circumstances with the Tao ancestor's temperament. How could he ignore it? Naturally, he would rather waste such a long time to guide the native cultivators onto the right path. This is the end of the preaching. You'll have to comprehend the rest on your own. On a certain day, after hundreds of millions of years, the Tao ancestor ended his preaching with this sentence. At this moment, the hall that he had opened up was already filled with tens of millions of disciples. Among these disciples, only a small portion of them had stepped into the tribulation realm. Most of the remaining ones had different levels. Some were already close to the tribulation realm, while some are not even false saints. The reason for this was that the higher one's cultivation level was, the less they relied on time. The Khanate grand heavenly realm naturally depended on one's talent and comprehension. However, that was only in a certain amount of time. If there was an infinite amount of time, even a pig could cultivate to the Khanate grand heavenly realm. Of course, such an infinite amount of time had to be calculated in at least trillions of billions of years to reach the standard. When it came to the higher level, the quasi-saint realm, the situation was different. Although there was an infinite amount of time, such as trillions of billions of years, it could indeed greatly increase a cultivator's chances of becoming a quasi-saint. However, there would still be a portion of cultivators who, due to various reasons, could not become a quasi-saint even if they spent an infinite amount of time. Even if the probability was not too high. As for the pseudo-saint realm, it was much more difficult to achieve compared to the quasi-saint realm. There were many cultivators who could not reach this level even if they had an infinite amount of time. Compared to the quasi-saint realm, there were many more cultivators who could not reach this level. Just like that, the higher the realm, the more cultivators would not be able to break through and enter this realm under the infinite amount of time, all the way until the tribulation realm. At this point, the meaning of the accumulation of time was almost non-existent. Whether one could break through or not depended entirely on oneself, one's concept, and one's will. The accumulation of time could only allow him to live a little longer. If he couldn't comprehend the key and understand the truth, he wouldn't be able to break through even if he had billions and trillions of trillions and trillions of trillions and trillions of years to live. It was precisely because of this principle that the higher one's realm was, the fewer cultivators there were. That was why the invitations in the palace were like this. However, for the Tao ancestor, he was already very satisfied with such a scene. After all, he could not expect all the native cultivators to be geniuses and become tribulation realm experts, could he? Even a novel would not dare to write such a thing. When the disciples heard the Tao ancestor's last words, they all bowed respectfully and shouted, "Thank you for your lecture, teacher. We will never forget teacher's benevolence." Hearing this, the Tao ancestor did not say anything else. He only nodded indifferently, and with a blur, he disappeared from the palace and the continent. When he reappeared, he was already on the next continent. Compared to the previous continent, the information and principles contained in this continent were much more profound. Even if he had successfully broken through, it would be much more difficult for him to comprehend it. The Tao ancestor had already expected this, but his emotions did not change much at this moment. He began to wholeheartedly comprehend it. Compared to before, this time, when this Tao ancestor resonated with this layer of land, tens of thousands of years had passed, and not a single disciple had followed him into this layer of land. After completing the resonance and accelerating the flow of time, the Tao ancestor swept his gaze across the entire continent. When he did not see any familiar figures, he could not help but sigh. It was obvious that none of his disciples had achieved a breakthrough like he had. There's still a long way to go. Sighing, the Tao ancestor did not waste much time. After spending millions of years to stabilize his realm, he built a palace on this continent and engraved his various comprehensions on this continent, as well as some of the subtle points of cultivation. Although he could not always wait here for his disciples, who he did not know when they would arrive, it did not mean that he had given up on them. Instead, he used this method of recording his comprehensions to pass on his various harvests to his disciples so that they would not be discouraged because they could not see the direction, and in the end, it would affect his plan to revitalize the native cultivators. Only then did he leave this layer of the continent and head towards the deeper layers. Just like that, the Tao ancestor would do the same thing on every continent. Before he knew it, he had already reached the 400th continent. Chapter 2509. After sharing memories with the distressed middle-aged man, the Tao ancestor already had a clear understanding of the direction of his cultivation. Under the infusion of the principles and mysteries of each continent's resonance, his cultivation realm increased extremely quickly. Very quickly, he reached the bottleneck between the second tribulation and the third tribulation. If it was before, he could only try his luck and wait for the opportunity to break through the bottleneck. But now, after obtaining those memories, he already knew what method he should use to have a higher chance of breaking through the bottleneck. In this way, the bottleneck only shackled him on 2 continents, but it had already been broken through, allowing him to directly become a third tribulation powerhouse. When he broke through to the third tribulation powerhouse, the continent he was on was the 403rd level. After that, the first level also became another natural chasm for the Tao ancestor's many disciples. If there were a few disciples who could catch up to him and follow him to the 403rd level, then after this level, he could only tread deeper alone. Moreover, it could be predicted that his state of solitude would continue for many, many years. In fact, even when he reached the 999th level, no one would be able to catch up to him. In the end, it still can't compare to the path of a real Tao master. In the central core of the Forbidden Area, Luo Fan occasionally swept his gaze over the 999 floors of the tower and could not help but sigh inexplicably in his heart. He was actually happy to see the Tao ancestor become a second tribulation powerhouse after receiving the distressed middle-aged man's guidance. After all, although he wanted to simulate the Tao sovereign path and use his own methods to raise a native cultivator to a level comparable to the cultivators on the Tao sovereign path, it did not mean that he had to completely abandon the influence of the Tao sovereign path. He had to completely avoid the native cultivators from learning the cultivation concept of the Tao sovereign path. In fact, he had a fixed standard in his heart. As long as this final standard could be achieved, he would be happy to see the native cultivators receive any guidance during this process, even if they were taught the Tao of cultivation by cultivators from the outside world. His final test was whether or not these native cultivators could truly leave the 999 levels of the pagoda and be accepted and acknowledged by the 5th level of the path to becoming a Tao sovereign. As long as the native cultivators could be accepted and acknowledged, it meant that his simulation of the first 4 levels had been successful. Otherwise, it would mean that his simulation had failed. Even if he had nurtured countless 5th tribulation powerhouses in the process, it was the same. Don't forget that in the first few levels of the Tao sovereign path, there were also many native cultivators who had transcended their own world. But where did they go after transcending? They had indeed entered the Tao master's path. However, they had not entered the layer of the Tao master's path where their world was located. Instead, they had been transferred to the entrance of the Tao master's path, to the first layer. Obviously, this was what a normal native cultivator would encounter after transcending their own world. If Luo Fan's plan for the 999 floors of the pagoda didn't succeed, then even if these indigenous cultivators became fourth or fifth tribulation powerhouses, they wouldn't directly enter the fifth floor after leaving the 999 floors of the pagoda and wouldn't be accepted by the fifth floor. Instead, they would have been transferred to the first level under the influence of the great law of the Tao Sovereign Path to undergo the test of the Tao Sovereign Path. Finally, after passing through the layers of obstacles and ascending the steps, there was a slight possibility of reaching the fifth level. For Luo Fan, everything else was illusory. As long as the final result could be achieved, it meant that his 999-story continent of the High Pagoda could slightly replace the previous 4-story Tao Master. By then, the mysterious and wonderful principles and mysteries contained in the 999-story pagoda continent alone would be enough to greatly expand his foundation, not to mention the other benefits that the existence of the 999-story pagoda continent would bring him. Thinking in his heart, Luo Fan withdrew his gaze and was about to continue the state of cultivation. Suddenly, he felt a trace of something wrong, as if there seemed to be a trace of difference in the forbidden area. What is this? Feeling the difference, he was shocked. Then, he immersed his perception in the forbidden area and began to carefully observe everything in the entire forbidden area, searching for the thing that made him feel that something was wrong. After some careful investigation, he suddenly discovered the source of it. It was a strange and obscure fluctuation. A strange fluctuation that filled the entire forbidden area and enveloped all the areas in the forbidden area. Who is it? Luo Fan frowned and said faintly. The moment these words left his mouth, it naturally transformed into some kind of obscure and strange ripple that violently collided with the obscure and mysterious ripple that had existed for an unknown amount of time and that he had only discovered its existence at this moment. Although this was the first time he had seen this kind of fluctuation, what kind of existence was Luo Fan? Just by slightly sensing this fluctuation, he already knew the characteristics of this fluctuation. He understood that this fluctuation was a kind of probing fluctuation, an extension of the perception of some existence. In other words, the existence of this fluctuation meant that there was some existence that he did not know, peeping at the forbidden area that he ruled in this extremely strange way. For this situation, for Luo Fan, it was like someone had secretly installed a camera in his home. Naturally, he felt a strong sense of offense in his heart. In that instant, the words he uttered not only conveyed his will, but also fiercely poured his intense displeasure into it. It contained the comprehension he had gained from creating the 999-story continent. As soon as it entered the ripples, it naturally turned into an invisible layer of mysterious light that was divided into 999 layers. The mysterious light grew endlessly, and it shot towards the source of the ripples in a cycle. The source of the fluctuation was clearly not nearby, but somewhere that was separated by who knew how much time and space it was. If it was an ordinary living being, even if it was an attack from the light of the universe, it would probably take a few breaths to surpass these space-times and reach the source of the fluctuation. However, at this moment, the invisible mysterious light that Luo Fan's undulations had evolved directly merged with the undulations emitted by the source of the undulations. It simply ignored the obstruction of the boundless undulations and directly arrived at the source of the undulations, fiercely blasting towards the source of the undulations. The reason for such a difference was naturally not because Luo Fan's comprehension had surpassed the might of the light of the universe, and he could do things that the light of the universe could not. In reality, even if he could do that, Luo Fan's comprehension was still extremely far from the light of the universe. If he really faced the light of the universe, such a method would not be able to put up much of a resistance before it would be crushed. In reality, the reason for this was that the concealment method of the source of the fluctuation was a concealment method that completely targeted the light of the universe. Among the various arrangements, all the obstacles were logical responses to the light of the universe. For example, if there were changes in this layer of space-time that were arranged here, the light of the universe would respond to certain changes. If it did not succeed, it would change to another response. If it did not succeed, it would change to another response. In this way, the power of the light of the universe would be delayed layer by layer. In the end, if there were enough targeted changes, the power of the light of the universe would naturally be delayed for a longer time. This delay was clearly enough for the source of the fluctuation to react. It could either escape, use the light of the universe to resist, or use other methods. Everything was feasible. At this moment, the source of the fluctuation had set up barriers against the light of the universe. There were hundreds of trillions of them. It was precisely because of this that the power of the light of the universe could be delayed for a few breaths. However, the fluctuation that Luo Fan released now was different. Although he had added his own comprehension from setting up the 999-story tall tower continent into it, it was still targeted fluctuation after all. This kind of ripple could be like a fish in water amidst the ripple released by the source of the ripple, easily going against the ripple. In this way, the existence of the ripple was equivalent to directly bypassing the barrier of an unknown number of trillions of space and directly constructing a path from this forbidden area to the source of the ripple. As long as one could eliminate the obstruction of the original ripple, one would naturally be able to easily bypass all obstacles and directly reach the source of the ripple. It was precisely because of this that the invisible, mysterious light fluctuation could actually surpass the light of the universe for such a long time and be traced back to the source of the fluctuation. As the invisible, mysterious light ruthlessly blasted into the source of the fluctuation, Luo Fan finally saw what the source of the fluctuation was. It was a cultivator whose light of the universe had already reached a certain level of perfection. And at this moment, he could ascend to the 6th floor at any time. This cultivator was completely unfamiliar to Luo Fan, but there was a kind of arrogance around him that he could only see from the disciples of the Tao Master. It was a kind of arrogance that looked down on everything, as if he was the master of the path of the Tao Master, and all other existences were just guests, receiving their gifts and begging them for something, a disciple of the Tao Master. Luo Fan looked at this person, and he already had an understanding in his heart. At this moment, the cultivator already understood that he had been discovered by Luo Fan. He could not help but sigh faintly and said, "I am the previous generation's 5th senior brother. Greetings, fellow Luo Fan. I remember that you guys already acknowledged me as the master of this forbidden area back then," Luo Fan said indifferently. As he spoke, a root condensed from the light of the universe suddenly rushed out of his body and fiercely poured into the endless brilliance around him. In an instant, it passed through the hundreds of trillions of space-time barriers and directly arrived where the so-called previous 5th senior brother was. With a fierce tear, it had already torn open a door that led straight to the void. With the invisible, mysterious light released by Luo Fan as a guide, the root of the light of the universe was already able to ignore the various defensive measures against the light of the universe. It easily passed through all obstacles and reached the source of the fluctuation. The complexion of the previous generation's 5th senior brother slightly changed at this moment. The light of heaven and earth that floated behind his head like a bright moon slightly squirmed, and a mysterious power was released from it. It was as if the endless world had condensed in one place, and it fiercely smashed towards the roots of the light of heaven and earth released by Luo Fan. This smash felt like billions of worlds were ruthlessly crushing down on it. Before it even arrived, it had already changed space-time, causing the space-time around the root to frantically extend at this moment. It turned into billions of endless universes, and it fiercely pushed towards the root of the light of the universe that had been released by Luo Fan. Just this move alone was already much stronger than almost all the existences that possessed the light of the universe that Luo Fan had seen before. Even the 2 balls of light that had fused with the light of the universe, the 2 balls of light that had been constantly thinking of ways to pull other cultivators into the abyss that had fused with the light of the universe, were actually inferior in comparison. However, such a move was nothing to the root at all. It must be known that the root had completely devoured everything in the perfect world that Luo Fan had encountered in the previous great calamity. Compared to ordinary light of the universe, it had already completed some kind of indescribable sublimation. Although the previous fifth senior brother's move was powerful, it was ultimately still at the level of a certain kind of perfect light of the universe. In the end, it still did not sublimate. In this way, in the face of such crushing and powerful pressure, the root only trembled slightly, and it had already brazenly completely destroyed the countless boundless universes around it. In the blink of an eye, the surroundings were restored to their original state of the void. Then, before the power that seemed to have turned into countless condensed worlds could hit it, the root rushed up on its own and directly stabbed into the power. It shook slightly. With this shake, the power instantly collapsed and dissipated like sand, as if it had never appeared in the first place. It disappeared without a trace. What? The former fifth senior brother's expression changed greatly. The light of the world instantly enveloped his body and brought him back. He directly broke through the void, wanting to quickly leave this place where he was hiding. Chapter 25:10. While the former fifth senior brother was struggling with all his might, the layers of space-time had already been completely destroyed. The distance between the space and Luo Fan's location was rapidly shortened. In the blink of an eye, the space was completely connected to where Luo Fan was. It seemed like he had been completely pulled into the forbidden area. By now, how could the former fifth senior brother not know that he could no longer escape? A look of fear appeared on his face. Although he quickly calmed down, Luo Fan had already noticed it. Since you've already acknowledged me as the ruler of this place, any plans to target this forbidden area must go through me. What fellow Taoist did just now violated the rules, Luo Fan said to the previous generation's fifth senior apprentice brother. The former fifth senior brother sighed and said, I made a mistake. May I know what price I have to pay for you to let me go? He very straightforwardly admitted his mistake. This was naturally not because he was very honest, but because he clearly felt that he was no match for the ruler before him. The ruler before him was far more powerful than what he had displayed before. Moreover, he was countless times more powerful. Based on the strength he had displayed before, although the former fifth senior brother did not have absolute confidence in defeating him, he was confident that he would be on par with him. However, this time, the former fifth senior brother had only taken a slight peek at Luo Fan's plan in the forbidden area, and he had actually been discovered. The former fifth senior brother did not even have the ability to resist before he was subdued. Under such circumstances, how could he still maintain the grandeur of the former fifth senior brother? However, he could only obediently admit that he had failed. Based on his understanding of the ruler, as long as he did not resist stubbornly, the ruler would not directly kill him. As long as the ruler did not kill him, then no matter what conditions the ruler had, no matter what losses he would incur, it would all be negotiable. Only when he thought of this did the fear in his heart completely disappear. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, Let's not talk about this for now. I'm just wondering why you are the former fifth senior brother. Could it be that the fifth senior brother had a term of office? What I saw on the first few floors seems to be different from this. The former fifth senior brother only said, It's this level that's special. My personality isn't suitable to be the fifth senior brother. Back then, after barely managing to hold the position for several trillion years, I took the initiative to step down and pass the position to someone else. That's why I, the previous generation's fifth senior brother, can only be found on the fifth floor. The other floors don't. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan came to a realization. With the previous generation's fifth senior brother's uncontrollable personality, he was clearly not qualified to be the fifth senior brother. It was only natural for him to resign on his own initiative or be forced to do so by others. I see. In that case, fellow Taoist has been spying on this forbidden area for such a long time. Have you discovered anything? Luo Fan asked again. The former fifth senior brother complained. Fellow Taoist has misunderstood. I didn't spy on this forbidden area for a long time. I was just spying on it and didn't even see clearly before I was discovered by fellow Taoist. Luo Fan sneered. How could he believe such words? He was confident in his control over this forbidden area. This sort of control told him that he hadn't sensed anything unusual at all before he'd noticed the fluctuations of the fifth senior brother's spying. This clearly showed that the fifth senior brother's spying wasn't set up during the period of time he'd sensed it earlier. It must have been done through some method similar to boiling a frog in warm water, spreading it bit by bit, and strengthening it bit by bit. Under such circumstances, how could the other party not have spied on something? I saw it. Fellow Taoist should know a very important secret of mine. Luo Fan immediately said. This wasn't a baseless guess. After all, if the fifth senior brother knew of his secrets and was worried that he would kill him to silence him, then he would say that he didn't know and didn't see anything. Such a development was too reasonable. When the former fifth senior brother heard this, he hurriedly said, No, I didn't discover any of fellow Taoist secrets. These days, my focus has been on the continent of the tall tower that fellow Taoist constructed. There isn't any of fellow Taoist's secrets there. This was because he was worried that Luo Fan would misunderstand him and directly kill him. Thus, he honestly stated his observation target. After hearing this, Luo Fan looked at him with an indescribable expression. The former fifth senior brother smiled bitterly and said helplessly, I was just embarrassed to say that I didn't see anything. It wasn't because I spied on fellow Taoists' unspeakable secrets. Luo Fan asked, Then what does fellow Taoist think of my continent of the tall tower? The former fifth senior brother sighed in admiration and said, Fellow Taoist, the use of the continent of the tall tower to test cultivators is secondary. The most important thing is its great significance to us cultivators. With this continent of the tall tower, I'm afraid no one will dare to offend fellow Taoist in the future. When Luo Fan heard this, he knew that the former fifth senior brother had already seen a deeper use of the continent of the tall tower. He couldn't help but smile faintly and said, It's a bit exaggerated to say that no one will dare to offend you. After all, most existences don't need it. Fellow Taoist, there's something you don't know. Don't think that no fellow Taoist can use the continent of the tall tower. That's only because there's no way to solve the worries in the future. It's not that they don't really need it. If they knew that fellow Taoist has this continent, I don't know how many fellow Taoists will come to ask for fellow Taoist's help. Even I'm afraid. A complicated expression appeared on the face of the previous generation's fifth senior brother. After hearing this, Luo Fan came to a realization and looked at the former fifth senior brother in front of him with an inexplicable expression. Then he smiled faintly and said, The final outcome this time isn't out yet. Whether it will succeed or not is still unknown. This time, fellow Taoist has broken the rules, so you should go to the continent of the tall tower. The former fifth senior brother's expression changed slightly. Go to the continent. He dared not believe that Luo Fan would let him off so easily. After all, going to the continent of the tall tower might require a lot of danger. But in terms of the final reward, it was not a punishment at all. Of course, it's a punishment after all, so fellow Taoist can't be treated like an ordinary living being. Luo Fan smiled faintly. As he spoke, the root of the light of heaven and earth that tore open the void and destroyed the endless space-time trembled slightly and directly pierced into the former fifth senior brother's body. Immediately after, the root trembled slightly and instantly cut off the connection with Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. Then, it instantly unfolded within the body of the previous fifth senior brother. It transformed into an indescribable space-time, and with a single devour, it sucked in everything that belonged to the fifth senior brother, including the light of the heavens and the earth. Only the former fifth senior brother's empty shell-like body was left in the void. During this process, the former fifth senior brother's light of heaven and earth instinctively resisted fiercely, trying to stop the light of heaven and earth's root from devouring it. But in the end, its essence was still much weaker than the root. Although the root had cut off its connection with the light of heaven and earth, it was still a part of the light of heaven and earth. On a deeper level, the hidden connection between the two of them still existed. This allowed the root to be endlessly replenished from the light of the world. In the end, it easily suppressed the resistance of the fifth senior brother's light of the world and devoured the space formed by the root. Fellow Taoist, what do you mean by this? The former fifth senior brother cried out in shock. Have a safe journey, fellow Taoist. Luo Fan only smiled. He gently sent the former fifth senior brother, who had already turned into a mortal. As the void twisted and changed, the former fifth senior brother had already passed through endless obstacles and arrived on the continent of the tall tower. He rushed down and directly charged into the first level of the continent of the tall tower. He let out a miserable cry and fell into the wilderness of the first level. The former fifth senior brother returned to his senses and looked around. He found that there was not a single trace of human habitation in the wilderness that he was in. The occasional movement he heard was the roars of wolves and beasts. The indescribable weakness in his body caused his mind to become fragile, and he only felt waves of panic. This kind of punishment is really a deterrent. The former fifth senior brother smiled bitterly. At that moment, he looked around and found a nearby cave whose entrance was covered by vines. After investigating it and finding that it was an abandoned nest, he went in and covered the vines again. He sat cross-legged and closed his eyes. He began to work hard to communicate with his own power, wanting to draw out some power so that he could have the ability to protect himself. However, the heaven and earth formed by the strange root was extremely thick and solid. No matter how hard he tried, he could not really sense the existence of his own power. As for the light of heaven and earth, he could not sense it at all. It was as if he had now truly become a mortal who had never come into contact with extraordinary power, who was born and raised on the ground, and who was extremely fragile. How is this possible? After comprehending for a few days, the former fifth senior brother finally hammered the ground hard. Over the past few days, he had not drawn out a trace of power at all. He could not even sense his own power or the light of heaven and earth at all. The strange root seal on him was almost absolute. At this moment, he even felt extremely hungry, as if his 5 viscera and 6 bowels had been digested. This hunger, which he had not felt for billions of years, made him feel at a loss, and he did not know how to react. It was also because of this irresistible hunger that he had to stop trying to sense and guide his own power at this time. Otherwise, according to his own patience, he would not stop even if he spent hundreds or thousands of years trying to sense and gain nothing. Cultivation. I want to cultivate. After being at a loss for a long time, the former fifth senior brother finally realized what he needed to do. He was now immortal. If he did not cultivate, all the needs of a mortal would appear on him. He would feel hungry, thirsty, tired, need to excrete, and die of old age. Only by stepping onto the path of cultivation and obtaining extraordinary power could he avoid all these. At that moment, he suppressed his hunger and sat down cross-legged. He began to activate his exhausted chi and blood. As his body trembled, he slowly drew the chi of heaven and earth from the outside world into his body. Gradually, it was converted into profound chi to make up for the deficiency in his body. After all, he was a disciple of the Tao Master. Even if there were some problems with his character and he could not bear the heavy responsibility of the fifth senior brother, he was not comparable to ordinary rogue cultivators. Even if he had become such a mortal creature, and it seemed that he could not use any extraordinary power at all, he could still easily attract the endless essence of the world, absorb a large amount of it into his body, and transform it into his own essence at an unimaginable efficiency. Finally, the hunger in his belly began to quickly subside. Half a day later, he could not help but burp, and an inexplicable fragrance spread around. How long has it been since I enjoyed such a pleasure? The former fifth senior brother opened his eyes, with an inexplicable and complicated expression on his face, and an indescribable satisfaction surged in his heart. He did not know when it began, but cultivation had become a habit for him, and the pursuit of upward progress had become so boring. This time, after being turned into a mortal again and relying on cultivation to maintain his own survival, he regained the joy of cultivation and the satisfaction brought by cultivation. This indescribable feeling made him understand something, and he faintly felt that his mind seemed to be a little tougher. At this moment, the previous generation's fifth senior brother heard some movements. This movement seemed to be very familiar to him, but also very strange. It took him a while to realize that it was the movement of a beast approaching here. He had felt this kind of movement countless times when he was still immortal billions of years ago. However, since he stepped onto the path of cultivation, he had not felt this kind of movement for billions of years, so he had unknowingly completely forgotten this kind of movement. It was also because of this that there was this feeling which seemed to be very familiar, but also very strange at the same time. The former fifth senior brother jumped up in horror, raised his hand to grab a stone not far away, and stared closely at the entrance covered by vines. Chapter 25:11. A few days later, on the first floor of the 999 floors of the pagoda, a powerhouse stood out from the crowd. He easily subdued a large number of poisonous insects and ferocious beasts in an area and occupied it, becoming the ruler of this area. The powerhouse who stood out was none other than the previous generation's fifth senior brother. Although he was in a rather sorry state when he first encountered the poisonous insects and ferocious beasts. However, the previous generation's fifth senior brother was still a powerhouse who had undergone 5 tribulations. The knowledge that came with such an identity was enough for him to far surpass all mortals. Even though everything about him had been sealed, and he could only enter the first floor with the body of an ordinary person, it was still the same. As the number of battles with the poisonous insects and ferocious beasts increased, his battle instincts that had been hidden for a long time began to awaken. His own strength also began to increase and sublimate with the help of the endless world's origin chi in the outside world. Just like that, in just a few days, he had already stood above the many poisonous insects and ferocious beasts in this area, becoming the supreme king of this area. Of course, it was only in this small area. After all, cultivation was not a process that could be achieved overnight. Even if one had countless experiences and knowledge, it would not be a problem for one to obtain the strength to protect oneself in a short period of time. However, it was still impossible for one to become a true powerhouse. Just a few days was clearly just a concept of a short period of time. In the original cave, the previous generation's fifth senior brother frowned as he pushed the extraordinary power in his body to continuously refine his body. He wanted to condense an immortal fetus. However, even though his use of power had reached the peak and the cultivation process over the past few days had been perfect, he was still far from truly condensing an immortal fetus. Although he had condensed the embryonic form of an immortal fetus several times, a strange law eventually destroyed his immortal fetus at the last moment, making it impossible for him to form an immortal fetus. It seemed like the master behind this floor was stopping him from condensing an immortal fetus, but it also seemed like he was not strong enough and had not accumulated enough strength to condense an immortal fetus. Could it be that I have to refine essence into chi, refine chi into spirit, refine spirit into void, and refine void into the Tao? After a long time, the former fifth senior brother frowned and felt displeased. According to his own deduction, although his current extraordinary power was not enough to form a perfect immortal fetus, it should be enough for him to form the embryonic form of the immortal fetus and instantly become a half-step bodiless immortal. I'm very familiar with the previous realms. They're completely meaningless. As long as I can form an immortal fetus, nothing else will be a problem. I'll be able to skip several realms and transcend the limits of my lifespan. What's the point of going through them again? He had no choice but to disperse his broken immortal fetus and begin to circulate his extraordinary power. He began to circulate his body according to the orthodox cultivation system. No matter what was going on, the most important thing for him now was to transcend the limits of his lifespan. He was a fifth tribulation powerhouse and should not be shackled by the limits of his lifespan. Even if 1 trillion years had passed, he should still be unscathed and would not change at all. However, he was now completely sealed. He could even feel hunger and had to eat to prevent himself from starving to death. Under such circumstances, how could he guarantee that he would not die after 100 years? As for what would happen after he died, he did not want to know at all. As long as he formed an immortal fetus, even if it was done in one step, he would not be a true bodiless immortal without going through the previous realms. However, he would be able to transcend the limits of his lifespan. If there were no disasters or tribulations, he would be able to live forever. Compared to other things, this was especially important to him. As someone who needed to spend 100,000, 1 million, or even tens of millions of years to comprehend something, a lifespan of 100 years was clearly not something he could endure. However, it was a pity that things did not develop as perfectly as he had imagined. At this moment, the cave was completely different from when he first entered it. The vines outside had been completely chopped off, and the entire cave was covered with extremely soft bee skins that emitted an indescribable fragrance. There were hundreds of night pearls hanging on the walls of the cave, giving off a lustrous brilliance, causing the entire cave to be as bright as day. Outside the cave, dozens of ferocious beasts were either curled up, lying on the ground, standing quietly, or patrolling. They had surrounded the mountain. Of course, they did not want to besiege the mountain and attack the former fifth senior brother. Instead, they were protecting the mountain and the former fifth senior brother. Obviously, they were the venomous insects and ferocious beasts that had been completely subdued by the former fifth senior brother in the past few days. Looking at how loyal they were, it was obvious that they had been completely subdued. After all, this area was only an extremely small area in the entire wildlands. In fact, it was nothing compared to this mountain range. Although becoming the ruler of this area would allow the former fifth senior brother to barely gain a foothold and not have to worry about food and clothing, it did not mean that he had everything planned out. However, it did not mean that he had everything planned out. Conflicts between different areas would happen from time to time. The chaos in this area had obviously given the living beings in other areas a chance to expand their territories. There was no telling when the kings of other regions would take a liking to this region and attack it directly. If they did not properly defend this area and defend against the attacks from the rulers of other areas, the former fifth senior brother might be completely buried at any time. Because of this, there were so many patrols and guards around this area. After realizing that he could not succeed by taking a shortcut, the former fifth senior brother could only obediently follow the orthodox cultivation method and slowly increase his realm and strength. With the help of many ferocious beasts, he did not need to worry about anything else. He could only focus on cultivating. In just 100 days, he seemed to have broken through one realm after another, brazenly breaking through the bottleneck between a mortal and an itinerant immortal. He attracted the immortal ascension tribulation and raised this mountain range to the ground in just a few days. He even killed 99% of his ferocious beasts. Even he himself almost lost half of his life before he successfully passed the tribulation and became an itinerant immortal. When he finally became an itinerant immortal and boundless immortal light shone down from the sky, the former fifth senior brother felt an indescribable, complicated emotion welling up from the bottom of his heart. He had never felt that becoming an immortal was so difficult. After recalling the past few days, he had long since recalled the process of him becoming an immortal. Back then, when did he encounter any tribulation when he became an immortal? Not to mention the tribulation, even heaven and earth were congratulating him. He had only just broken through, yet heavenly flowers flew everywhere, golden lotuses surged, and heavenly music resounded. It was almost as if heaven and earth were pulling him to become an immortal. This time, there was actually such an accumulation of tribulations that almost razed this mountain range to the ground. If he didn't possess the memories of his past cultivation and was able to utilize the most correct method to deal with all the attacks within the tribulations, then perhaps he would have been obliterated before the tribulation was even halfway through. However, becoming an itinerant immortal was a huge leap for the former fifth senior brother. The increase in his strength was so great that it was tens of thousands of times greater than the increase that ordinary cultivators would receive after shedding mortality and becoming an immortal. After all, There were many techniques in his memories that could not be activated with ordinary extraordinary power. Only after becoming an itinerant immortal and possessing magical power could he activate some of them. Once he activated these abilities, his strength would naturally be worlds apart from before. Faced with such a situation, the former fifth senior brother only took a moment to convince himself before his expression became impassioned. He moved and turned into a beam of immortal light that shot into the sky, heading toward the human civilization outside the wildlands. In the wildlands, there were naturally countless exotic beasts that were stronger than itinerant immortals in terms of pure strength. If it was purely in terms of cultivation base, the former fifth senior brother was courting death by advancing so casually. Alas, the former fifth senior brother was the former fifth senior brother after all. How could his strength be limited by cultivation base? Along the way, all the exotic beasts that stood in his way, whether they were itinerant immortals, true immortals, or golden immortals, were easily annihilated by a beam of immortal light. Only primordial pure young beasts could stop him for a short while, but they were easily dealt with in the end. As for truly stopping him and subduing him, only innate grand Luo realm exotic beasts could do it. There were indeed such exotic beasts in the wildlands. However, they were completely disdainful of the former fifth senior brother. So long as he didn't pass by them, they would completely ignore him. The former fifth senior brother was quite astute. Although he was confident, he wasn't arrogant enough to think that he could easily defeat such innate grand Luo realm experts. Therefore, when he sensed the existence of such experts from afar, he immediately took a detour so as to avoid walking right into a trap and giving the other party no chance to turn a blind eye to him. Although I knew about it a long time ago, I still don't dare to believe it when I see it with my own eyes. A few days later, the former fifth senior brother could not help but think to himself as he stood above the clouds and looked at an extremely sacred palace in the distance. The plaque of the hall was engraved with the words Taoist Palace. The aura of time faintly flowed out from it, causing the palace to seem as if it had transcended the river of time. It seemed as if no matter how time flowed in the world, it would not be able to leave a single mark on it. Obviously, this palace was the so-called place of cultivation of the Tao ancestor. As a disciple of the Tao Exalt, the former fifth senior brother was even more repulsed by the title of Tao ancestor than those independent cultivators. After all, his master was the Tao Exalt. A native cultivator that was like an ant in his eyes called himself Tao ancestor. Didn't that mean that he wanted to surpass his master? How could he not be repulsed by that? Once I recover some strength, I'll definitely destroy this Tao palace. The former fifth senior brother could only say hatefully as he looked at the terrifying aura that emanated from the Tao palace, and then he turned around and left while concealing himself. Although his strength was comparable to a cultivator at the peak of the primordial pure sun realm, the aura that emanated from the palace was not lacking in the innate grand Luo realm. If he were to encounter such a strength, then the only outcome that awaited him would be failure. Even if he possessed various divine abilities and techniques that could injure those innate grand Luo realm cultivators by paying a certain price, it was not worth it in the end. After seeing this so-called Tao Palace, the former fifth senior brother quickly found a suitable place for cultivation and began to enter the path of closed-door cultivation that he was familiar with. In just a few hundred years, his cultivation realm had risen to the peak of the innate grand Luo realm, and there was only a small obstacle left before he could reach the demi-saint realm. Such a realm was not considered the highest on the first level of the continent. However, with the various divine abilities and techniques that he mastered and the various knowledge that he knew, his strength had already reached a level that could overwhelm all the cultivators on the first level. At this point, he originally intended to charge forward and break through the obstacle so that he could directly step into the demi-saint realm. In that case, his strength could be increased by thousands or even tens of thousands of times compared to his current strength. However, he could clearly feel that if he were to charge forward like that, he would face a great tribulation. It was a terrifying tribulation that could shake the entire first floor and almost completely destroy it. This feeling forced him to stop his intention to charge forward and carefully deduce why he felt this way. Karma. What kind of karma do I have? After some deduction, the former fifth senior brother turned pale with fright. He felt that he was shrouded by waves of absurdity. He felt that it was because of the heavy karma that he could not break through like that. His karma did not come from anywhere else. It came from this continent. It came from where he was, from the first level of the 999 continents created by the ruler of the Forbidden Land. How could he not feel that this situation was absurd? After all, he had only stepped into this continent for a short few hundred years. During these few hundred years, he had been wholeheartedly cultivating, and he did not even converse with other living beings more than 3 times. Under such circumstances, how could he have formed any karma on this continent? Unable to believe it, he carefully deduced dozens of times. He even spent most of his blood essence to calculate the last time. In the end, he slowly deduced the general situation. Chapter 25:12. As it turned out, when he sensed it carefully, he realized that he had an extremely deep karma with this continent. In other words, there was an extremely deep karma between him and the entire continent of the 999-story high tower. The karma was so strong that it almost locked him tightly on this continent, causing his every action and breath to deeply affect this continent, deepening the karma between him and this continent. It was as if some kind of invisible power was forcefully twisting the karmic connection between him and this continent. Under such circumstances, the difficulty of severing the karma between the former fifth senior brother and himself was tens of thousands of times more difficult than he had imagined. Moreover, even if he severed it now, the karma would still be reestablished. The longer it took, the deeper the karma would be. One day, when the karma completely devoured him, he would probably become one with the karma and would never be able to transcend it. The former fifth senior brother could still smile bitterly when he realized this. This was already a great improvement in his mentality after a period of cultivation. He still didn't know why Luo Fan had thrown him into the 999-story continent of the High Tower. But no matter what the reason was, improving himself and making his strength stronger and stronger was the best way for him to deal with it. Therefore, even though he knew it was a trap, he had no choice but to step into it. If I want to sever my karma with the world, I'll have to return everything I've gained from the world over the years. The former fifth senior brother thought to himself. The world within his body that he had opened up after becoming a Khanate Grand Luo opened up. Endless energies of the world and various substances flowed out and poured into the continent. Cultivators could only be self-sufficient when they reached the innate Grand Luo realm. Before that, cultivators had to obtain what they needed for cultivation from the outside world. This included the energy and substances needed for cultivation, as well as the various energies and substances needed to sustain life. As one's cultivation realm increased, the rate of absorption would also become faster and faster. The amount of absorption would naturally become more and more as time passed. Ordinary innate Grand Luo cultivators would already owe an enormous amount of energy and substances to the world before they could achieve it. In other words, he had formed a deep karma with the heavens and earth. Even if it wasn't on this continent, it would still be the same in other worlds. However, in other worlds, because the relationship between the world and cultivators was that of a mother and a child, the world did not pay much attention to this kind of karma. So long as a cultivator was able to stay in the heavens and the earth for a sufficiently long period of time after attaining the innate golden immortal realm, then the karma would naturally vanish and disperse. Even if there were occasionally innate golden immortal realm cultivators who hadn't repaid their karma, the heavens and the earth wouldn't make a fuss about it, because the innate golden immortal realm cultivator was born from the heavens and the earth itself. At most, the heavens and the earth would send down some tribulations. However, the former fifth senior brother and the continent were completely different at this moment. The former fifth senior brother was a disciple of the town master, a cultivator born outside the path of the town master. The relationship between him and the 999 levels of the pagoda was utterly unlike the relationship between an ordinary world and an innate golden immortal realm cultivator born within it. To the 999 levels of the pagoda, the former fifth senior brother was an invader. It was an invader who forcefully charged into its body and used brute force to seize the resources and energy of the continent. In this way, any bit of the spirit energy of the heavens and the earth that the former fifth senior brother absorbed would bear even greater karma than the native cultivators. In this way, under the accumulation of karma, it would naturally result in the current situation. When he broke through into the innate golden immortal realm, the karma between him and this continent was over 10,000 times greater than he'd imagined with regards to this. The previous fifth senior brother only needed to comprehend a little before he understood. He felt helpless and enlightened at the same time. Repaying the karma was not a simple matter. Even if he had opened the door to his inner world and allowed his inner world to continuously produce the world's origin energy and all sorts of materials, returning all the world's origin energy and materials that he had absorbed from his continent, it did not mean that he had completely severed his karma with his continent after doing this. In fact, accomplishing this was only the first step of severing the karma. The karma was not so simple to calculate. The calculation of karma was not as direct as a transaction of money and goods. The calculation of karma involved an even deeper level of influence. It was just like the karma between the former fifth senior brother and the continent. The karma between the two had to be calculated based on the significance of the energy and materials bestowed by the continent to the former fifth senior brother. Then it had to be calculated based on what the former fifth senior brother had done for the continent. At the very least, these two meanings should be equivalent so that the karma could be resolved. For the former fifth senior brother, what was the significance of the essence of the world and the materials that he had absorbed from his continent? It could be said that it was the energy and materials that supported his survival. It even changed his fate. If it wasn't for the energy and materials, the former fifth senior brother would have been dead for countless years. From this aspect, these energies and materials were practically his life and future to the former fifth senior brother. The significance of this was self-evident. How could the little bit of energy and materials he had given back to the continent compare to such a karma? Even if he were to return to this continent 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 times the amount of energy and matter that he had absorbed back then, it would be meaningless to this continent. To the continent, these energy and materials were simply dispensable. With these, the continent did not grow much. Without these, the continent would not lose anything. Under such circumstances, it was obviously a fool's dream to use these energy and materials to end the karma. Several years later, after feeling that he had returned tens of thousands of times the energy and materials he had absorbed to the continent, the former fifth senior brother sighed and sealed his inner world. He could feel that the karma between him and the continent had been slightly reduced. However, it was only slightly reduced. There was still an incomparably heavy karma that tightly entangled him, binding him to this continent. If that was all, he would definitely not stop. He would rather rely on his inner world to create enough energy and materials to fill the continent. Even if the amount required was beyond imagination, as long as he continued to improve, he would be able to end the karma between him and the continent one day. However, this method did not work at all, because he had sensed that no matter how much energy and materials he returned to the continent, it was impossible to reduce the karma between him and the continent. On the contrary, if he were to continue like this, he would deepen the karma between him and this mainland. Going too far was as bad as not going far enough, and things would move in the opposite direction when they reached an extreme. If I want to return the karma, I must carry out a fundamental change to the continent. Even if the change isn't as great as the change I experienced when I cultivated from a mortal to a connate grand heavenly realm cultivator, I must have that kind of prospect. The former fifth senior brother pondered for a long time and made a judgment in his heart. At this moment, he missed the state where he was completely self-sufficient and had no connection with the outside world before he was thrown into the continent with 999 levels of the tower. Various thoughts flashed through his mind, and his gratitude towards the world that he was born in became stronger than ever. He did not expect that if the world really cared about him, the karma would actually be so terrifying and difficult to deal with. This was the first time he, who had always looked down on the world and even felt that the world was restraining him and manipulating him like a chess piece, truly experienced it. Perhaps I need to do something for the world after I get out this time. The thought flashed through his mind. However, it was just a flash. After all, the current situation did not allow him to think about what would happen after he got out. According to the current trend, it would probably take hundreds of millions of years for him to be able to leave the continent with 999 levels of the tower and regain his freedom. Building a world was not a strange thing for the former fifth senior brother. In fact, with his experience of opening up countless worlds and nurturing countless worlds, it was not difficult to nurture a world from a barbaric and primitive state into a prosperous holy land for cultivation. As long as he was willing, there were countless methods that appeared in his mind. However, there was a prerequisite for all of this. That was, the world had to be under his control at will. A change at will. Without this prerequisite, 99% of the methods he could use would be rendered useless in an instant. Clearly, in this continent, with his strength that was restricted below the quasi-saint realm, because he had just reached the peak of the connate grand heavenly realm, he could only be considered as above average compared to the cultivation world on the continent. There was still a certain gap between him and the upper level, let alone the peak. With this kind of strength, it was obviously difficult to build the entire continent and let the continent have a future that it did not have in the past. From then on, it would be able to step on a path that could continuously improve and sublimate, even if he had ideas and plans. It's even more difficult than I imagined. The former fifth senior brother sighed and looked at the sky with an inexplicable gaze. He seemed to be able to see Luo Fan's faint smile in his eyes. After being in a daze for a long time, he calmed his emotions and left the cave residence where he cultivated in seclusion. He began to work hard to integrate into the cultivation world of this continent. What a deep karma. At the center of the forbidden area, Luo Fan looked at the former fifth senior brother from afar and could not help but feel emotional. The former fifth senior brother felt that he had been in the first level of the continent for a long time. However, in fact, compared to the outside world, he had actually been in there for less than a day. At this moment, there were still remnants of Luo Fan's aura where he was. The space that Luo Fan had pulled over from an unknown number of space-times had yet to completely calm down. There were still quite a few traces left behind. However, Luo Fan did not care about any of that at all. On this day, he was carefully observing the former fifth senior brother's experience in the continent of the Tall Tower. In fact, the former fifth senior brother had guessed wrongly. All the hardships that he had experienced were actually not set up by Luo Fan. In fact, it was only when he was thrown into the depths of the wilderness that Luo Fan had created the trouble for him. Apart from that, the difficulties that he had to cultivate, the various dangers that he had encountered, and even the karma that bound him to the first level of the continent, all of those were the troubles that outsiders would inevitably encounter after entering the continent to cultivate. In other words, they were the troubles that ordinary outsiders would inevitably encounter after entering the continent of the Tall Tower to cultivate. Although Luo Fan had some speculations about the troubles beforehand, he was not sure, and it was difficult for him to speculate how great the troubles would be. It was precisely because of this that he had specially sealed the former fifth senior brother and thrown him into the first level of the continent, intending to use him as an experiment. Only when the previous fifth senior brother encountered such a heavy karma did he finally understand that this sort of trouble was actually much greater than he'd imagined. With such great troubles, he would probably have to make some adjustments to the plan that he had come up with earlier. I wonder what will happen if I adjust my cultivation base to that of a connate, golden, heavenly realm cultivator. A thought suddenly flashed through his mind. With that thought, he turned his gaze to the cultivators near the continent of the Tall Tower, and his eyes flickered slightly. After looking for a long time, he finally gave up on the idea of looking for test subjects among the cultivators. Instead, he turned his gaze to the cultivators at the border of the forbidden area. Currently, there were still many cultivators who were not strong enough to enter the forbidden area outside the forbidden area, and they were trying to find a new route to enter the forbidden area. Such an attempt would obviously require a risk. From time to time, some cultivators would be devoured by the forbidden area because they had taken the wrong route. Some would be directly killed, and some would pay a huge price to escape. Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and soon, his gaze locked onto a cultivator who looked like a young man. The young man was currently carefully exploring the route. According to the direction that he was heading, he would step out of the safe route in just a few steps and be devoured by the endless light around him. Chapter 25:13. The young-looking cultivator was called Taoist Yuanzheng, and he was a rogue cultivator. He had been on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path for nearly 1,000,000,000 years. During this long period of time, he had been cultivating diligently, using all means to comprehend all the mysteries contained in the 5th level, and using all his efforts to improve himself. However, he did not know whether it was fate, opportunity, or simply luck. Up until now, he had only managed to condense the outline of the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. Even this outline was somewhat specious, and there was still a long way to go before it could truly condense into the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. He had spent 1,000,000,000,000 years just to achieve this, and he did not know how long it would take for him to ascend. Therefore, when Taoist Yuanzheng heard that there was a great opportunity in this forbidden area that could sublimate a cultivator's light of heaven and earth, and could also sublimate a cultivator's body, he was unwilling to give up this opportunity, even though he was not strong enough to step into this forbidden area. That was why he had appeared here today. The road ahead is confusing. How should I go? Taoist Yuanzheng was floating in the dazzling light, and his heart was filled with confusion. He had paid a huge price to obtain a safe passage to the land of opportunity, but suddenly, the surrounding environment changed drastically. Although he was extremely lucky and the place he was standing on was still safe, and the intensity of the light was still within his tolerance range, both the path forward and backward had disappeared. At this moment, he stood there, unable to see a safe path forward or backward. It could be said that he was in a dilemma, and he had no idea how to get out safely. He was standing at the intersection of the 2 balls of light, and a vortex's was faintly formed there. It was precisely because of this that this position was much safer than the other places around him. However, this was only temporary. After all, this vortex's was formed by the collision of the 2 balls of light. The collision of the light obviously could not last forever. As time went by, the 2 balls of light would gradually return to a stable state. This stability would naturally cause the vortex's to disappear, and in the end, he would truly be able to withstand the infinite light around him with his own body. In this case, it was obviously bad luck for him, and it meant that his last safe place had completely disappeared. Taoist Yuanzheng was quite clear about this situation. It was precisely because he knew this that he was at a loss. However, even if he was at a loss and didn't know the path ahead of him, he wouldn't give up just like that and wait for death. Very soon, he calmed himself down and began to carefully recall all the information he had obtained regarding the forbidden grounds. He used all the methods he had to sense the surroundings and deduce any possible safe paths. Of course, this was not a simple matter. In fact, it might even be an impossible task for him. Even if he had millions or billions of years, he might not be able to succeed, not to mention that he only had a few days before the vortex existed. The chances of success were even slimmer. After a few days, Taoist Yuanzheng could only barely calculate that the opposite direction might be slightly safer than the other directions. He wanted to continue divining and more accurately determine the safest path. However, the environment clearly did not allow him to do so. The vortex eye under his feet was already on the verge of collapse. Once the eye of the vortex collapsed, the surrounding light would drown him. At that time, even if he could deduce a safe path, it would be impossible for him to form it. In this way, even if he still couldn't find the way, he could only sigh and move forward. As he moved forward, the outline of the worldly light embryonic form surrounded his body, filling it with endless power and boundless concept divine abilities to protect himself. If it was anywhere else, with such a defense, even if heaven and earth were to collapse, it would be able to slightly block it. However, in this place, even if it was a normal forbidden area, he might not be able to hold on for even an instant. Luck did not befall Taoist Yuanzheng. According to his calculations, that direction was slightly safer than the other directions. However, it was still far beyond the limits of what he could bear. The moment he stepped out of the vortex, everything around him instantly collapsed. It was completely minced and devoured by the endless light, and finally disappeared without a trace. Following this change, the endless light fiercely pressed against Taoist Yuanzheng's body, as if the endless heaven and earth were collapsing at the same time, with a determination to destroy everything. In the end, I didn't have that kind of luck. Seeing this, Taoist Yuanzheng's face showed an indescribable bitterness. The despair that should have appeared did not appear in his eyes. In that instant, the memories of his cultivation that he did not know how many billions of years flashed across his mind like a scroll painting. The speed of it became faster and faster. Finally, when his consciousness turned black, the scroll painting had just finished flashing. My life has been worth it. In the end, he only left such a sigh. After an unknown amount of time, Taoist Yuanzheng woke up from his daze. I'm not dead. He looked surprised and doubtful. He clearly felt that he had completely lost consciousness, and even the memory before his death had appeared. How could he still be alive? As for suspecting that he was in a dead state and had come to another world after dying, it was naturally impossible for him to have such a thought, just like how a mortal would. No matter what, he was a fifth tribulation expert, a powerful existence that could cause irreversible damage to the great heaven and earth. Such an existence naturally had self-awareness and self-control that ordinary mortals couldn't compare to. He did not even need to sense whether he was alive or dead. As long as his consciousness returned, he would instantly know whether he was dead or alive. At this moment, he could clearly feel that he was not dead. He was still alive. My cultivation. Very quickly, he discovered another anomaly. His originally vast and boundless strength had actually been suppressed by 9,999% at this moment. Roughly speaking, he was only left with the strength of an innate great Luo. Moreover, the effect of this suppression was extremely mysterious. It permeated almost every aspect of him. It was not just a simple external suppression, but it also made him feel as if time had turned back and he had returned to the time when he was an innate great Luo. Whether it was his physical state, strength state, or even mental state, they had completely recovered to the state of an innate great Luo. The only difference was that he still retained the memory of being a fifth tribulation expert. Looking around, he realized that he was in a very ordinary wilderness. With a sweep of his perception, the situation within an unknown distance of tens of thousands of miles was reflected in his heart. Even though he had been suppressed by 9,999%, he was still an innate great Luo, a powerful existence that could be self-sufficient and create his own world. Although the strength of his perception was insignificant compared to his original self, it was still extremely extraordinary. In such a situation, it was normal for him to be able to instantly sense the space within an unknown distance of tens of thousands of miles. What a prosperous place of cultivation. It seems to be somewhat similar to the place controlled by the Tao Master. Taoist Yuanzheng felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity in his heart as he sensed everything within this area. Being able to reach the fifth level of the Tao Master's path, he was not a nobody in the great Tao Master universe. Naturally, he had seen the places controlled by countless cultivators. Even the places controlled by the Tao Master were no exception. The area he was in now, whether it was the rules of cultivation, the division of residences of different races, or the relationship between mortals and cultivators, was quite similar to the area controlled by the Tao Master he had seen in the great Tao Master universe billions of years ago. Seeing this, how could he not understand that this place must have something to do with the Tao Master universe? Just as he was feeling curious, Suddenly, a flight light broke through the void from afar. While Taoist Yuanzheng was slightly stunned, the flight light had already stopped in front of him, turned around, and turned into a jade talisman. Which Taoist sent me this message? Taoist Yuanzheng was extremely curious. He raised his hand to take the jade talisman, and after sensing it carefully, he knew what was going on. This jade talisman was from the Tao Master who claimed to be the former fifth senior brother. Among them, the former fifth senior brother invited him to be a guest, saying that they were in a similar situation and that they might be able to cooperate. Although Taoist Yuanzheng was a little wary of the Tao Master's sect, judging from the surrounding environment, he knew that the Tao Master's sect should have some power in this part of the world. Therefore, Taoist Yuanzheng thought for a while, and then flew in the direction indicated by the jade talisman. The flying speed of an innate Grand Luo cultivator was extremely fast. Moreover, Taoist Yuanzheng had the memory of a fifth tribulation expert, and his control of power and power was not comparable to an ordinary innate Grand Luo cultivator. His flying speed was naturally several times faster than an ordinary innate Grand Luo cultivator. In just a few minutes, he had already arrived at the place indicated by the jade talisman, in front of a floating cave abode suspended in the void. From afar, one could see that this floating cave abode seemed to be the location of the spiritual vigor of a large area around it. It was as if the spiritual vigor of the entire area was constantly being absorbed by this floating cave abode. The absorption of spiritual vigor not only caused the spiritual vigor to undergo various subtle changes, but also made the floating cave abode almost become the core of this large area. The safety of this place was closely related to the safety of a large area around it. It seemed that no matter what existence it was, as long as it did not want to destroy this large area, it would not be able to harm this cave abode. Looking at this scene, Taoist Yuanzheng frowned slightly. This situation meant that this part of the world was not peaceful. After all, if it was peaceful, why would it be necessary to tie itself to this large area? When he landed in front of the cave abode, there was already a person standing in front of it to welcome him. This person was none other than the former fifth senior brother. The world that Taoist Yuanzheng had entered was the first floor of the 999-floored continent of the Tall Pagoda. It was also the place where the former fifth senior brother was punished to enter. In fact, the reason why there was such a big change here and why the former fifth senior brother, who originally had no status, had actually become the master of this large area was actually quite simple. That was because in the few days that Luo Fan had been waiting for Taoist Yuanzheng, hundreds of millions of years had passed in the first layer of the continent. After such a long time, with the former fifth senior brother's ability, he did not completely control the entire first floor. This was because he was not good at it. What was so strange about becoming the master of this area? After seeing Taoist Yuanzheng, the former fifth senior brother went forward to apologize, saying that he had to tidy up the world and could not leave the cave abode at will. That was why he sent a flying talisman to invite Taoist Yuanzheng over. Naturally, Taoist Yuanzheng did not care about this. This time, he came here to understand why he was here and how he could leave. However, it was not to enjoy the preferential treatment of the former fifth senior brother. You don't have to worry about such a small matter. Fellow Taoist, you just said that you and I are in the same situation. May I know what our situation is now? Taoist Yuanzheng said, after introducing himself. The former fifth senior brother was slightly stunned. Did this fellow Taoist in front of him not know what had happened? How could this be possible? He was obviously a practitioner from the fifth floor of the Road of Tao Master, just like himself. His aura could not be concealed at all, so he could not have sensed it wrongly. Fellow Taoist, don't you know? Didn't you see the master of the forbidden area? The former fifth senior brother asked with a frown. Hearing this, Taoist Yuanzheng was even more confused. The master of the forbidden area? When did he see the former fifth senior brother? Seeing the former fifth senior brother's doubtful face, he did not hide anything and told him about his experience. He included how he found the safe passage in the forbidden area, how he lost his way due to the drastic change in the forbidden area, how he took the risk, and how he was sent here after he thought he was dead. Listening to all this, The former fifth senior brother showed a look of understanding. The way he looked at Taoist Yuan Zheng seemed to have changed a little. He seemed to be a little enlightened and a little envious. Faintly, there was also a kind of indescribable curiosity. Obviously, he was thinking about the intention of the master of the forbidden area. Chapter 25:14. The former fifth senior brother sighed inwardly. He originally thought that Taoist Yuan Zheng was thrown into this place because he provoked the lord of the forbidden land, just like him. He did not expect that he was thrown into this place for an experiment when he was on the brink of death. At this moment, he had mixed feelings in his heart. He was a little envious and sympathetic of Taoist Yuan Zheng's misfortune. He envied Taoist Yuan Zheng for being able to maintain his current strength as an innate Grand Luo, and he was even more envious that he was thrown into this place when he was on the brink of death. On the other hand, he sympathized with Taoist Yuan Zheng because what he would encounter next was not much different from being punished. He was afraid that he would be tortured horribly, just like himself. Nevertheless, he was more envious of Taoist Yuan Zheng. Compared to being tortured, surviving was obviously the most important thing. He did not hide anything from Taoist Yuan Zheng and told him everything he knew. After all, no matter what, he and Taoist Yuan Zheng were from the same place. There might be many conflicts between them in the outside world, but on this continent with 999 stories, their relationship was much closer than that of the native cultivators here. Moreover, compared to the cultivators who were also outsiders, their relationship was much closer. After all, although they were all outsiders, the other foreign cultivators who had taken the initiative to enter the Tall Tower continent had different objectives. The other foreign cultivators were not bound by the karma of the continent at all, and could enter and leave the continent at will. This was equivalent to a tourist and a prisoner. Of course, there was a huge difference between them. Prisoners would form certain friendships with other prisoners, but he had never heard of any friendships between prisoners and tourists who came to visit. Taoist Yuan Zheng was stunned when he heard the former fifth senior brother's explanation. After a long time, he smiled bitterly and sighed. The Lord of the Forbidden Land saved my life after all, so it's reasonable for me to cooperate with him in some experiments. The former fifth senior brother only smiled faintly. He knew that Taoist Yuan Zheng could only say that, regardless of what he was thinking. I want to travel around this world. Do you have any suggestions, fellow Taoist? Taoist Yuan Zheng asked the former fifth senior brother. The former fifth senior brother smiled and said, "If you want to travel, fellow Taoist can go to the west. There is a Tao palace there that was established by the most powerful native cultivator. Although he is arrogant, he still has some tricks up his sleeve. If fellow Taoist goes there, you will definitely gain something." Holy Ji Palace? Before coming here, Taoist Yuan Zheng had never come into contact with any information about the continent with 999 floors of the high tower. This was the first time he had heard of the existence of this Tao Palace. "You'll know once you get there," said the former fifth senior brother with a smile. Taoist Yuan Zheng didn't ask any more questions. After conversing with this fifth senior brother of the previous generation for some time and getting some general knowledge from him, he took his leave and headed west. After traveling for billions of miles, a majestic palace appeared in front of him. It seemed to be the core of the world, the center of the earth. As it moved and changed, it seemed to stir up the winds and clouds in the world, causing the entire world to revolve around it. What a wonderful place! The founder of this Taoist palace is indeed extraordinary. Taoist Yuan Zheng couldn't help but exclaim in admiration. This Taoist palace was built by the Taoist ancestor who had a great reputation among the native cultivators. Its existence was a symbol to the native cultivators, a symbol that they were not inferior to the visitors from outer space. Therefore, this Taoist palace could almost be called the Holy Land of the native cultivators. Since it was a holy land, it was naturally impossible for other cultivators to come and go freely. However, there were countless protective measures set up around this Taoist palace. Unless Taoist Yuan Zheng was not suppressed at all and was still in the peak state of a fifth tribulation expert, it would be difficult for him to sneak past these protective measures. Otherwise, even a second or third tribulation expert might not be able to do it, Taoist Yuanzheng was now a connate Grand Luo cultivator through and through. Under such circumstances, he naturally couldn't enter at will. He could only obediently follow the normal procedures and apply to enter. As a holy land for cultivation, this Taoist palace couldn't allow other cultivators to enter at will. Similarly, he couldn't completely prohibit other cultivators from entering either. After all, the Taoist ancestor built this Taoist palace to improve the cultivation level of the native cultivators and enhance their strength. If he completely prohibited cultivators from entering, wouldn't that be going against the Taoist ancestor's wishes? Who would dare to do such a thing? Therefore, although it was incomparably difficult, in theory, any cultivator had the opportunity to enter the Taoist palace to comprehend the various auras left behind by the Taoist ancestor and the various magical techniques. Taoist Yuanzheng was completely suppressed. Currently, he didn't look like a foreign cultivator at all. He gave off the feeling of a native cultivator who was born and raised on this first layer of the mainland. Even if the manager of this Taoist palace encountered all kinds of magical techniques by chance, he still couldn't detect any difference between him and the native cultivators. In this way, the first obstacle for him to enter the Taoist palace had obviously been inadvertently erased. The person who controlled this Taoist palace was, of course, a disciple of the Taoist ancestor. Even if the Taoist ancestor didn't establish a sect himself. However, with so many disciples under him, there would eventually be some who wanted to establish their own sections. Moreover, with such a large base number, there were still quite a number of disciples who established their own sections. After hundreds of millions of years of development, these sects had long since become colossal existences, occupying almost all of the abodes and blessed lands on the first level of the continent. They had become the so-called few great sects, several great holy lands, several great treasure pavilions, and so on. This Taoist palace was jointly managed by all the sects, sacred grounds, and treasure pavilions. Anyone who wanted to enter would have to obtain the approval of these sects, sacred grounds, and treasure pavilions. In order to show that they didn't take the Taoist palace for themselves, these sects announced many standards and tasks. As long as one reached a certain standard and completed a certain number of tasks, they would be able to enter the Taoist palace for a certain number of days, of course. These standards were naturally extremely high. These tasks were also extremely difficult. If it was an ordinary innate Grand Luo cultivator, it would probably take millions or even tens of millions of years to reach the standards and complete enough tasks. Only those who were the Boundary Saint realm could easily complete the corresponding tasks. It could be said that these alone had completely eliminated innate Grand Luo cultivators. Naturally, Taoist Yuanzheng was unaware of this. When he came to apply to enter the Taoist palace, the innate Grand Luo cultivator who received him casually threw a jade slip to him and sent him away. The jade slip recorded in detail how to obtain the qualification to enter the Taoist palace. Even though Taoist Yuanzheng was a fifth tribulation expert, he couldn't help but be amazed by the complexity of it. If it wasn't for him, it would probably take 7 to 8 million years to complete these tasks. Looks like they're a little unwilling to open up the Taoist palace. Taoist Yuanzheng understood as he put away the jade slip. Although it wasn't difficult for him to complete the mission, it wasn't difficult at all. With his ability, he might be able to complete these tasks in 1 or 2,000 years. However, he didn't plan to complete these tasks. After all, he didn't want to obtain any important information from the Taoist palace. He just wanted to see the mysteries of the Taoist palace. If he could easily enter, he naturally wouldn't be stingy with his time. However, if he had to pay a huge price to enter, he would be too lazy to do it. The application area was bustling. A large number of innate Grand Luo cultivators gathered here. Taoist Yuanzheng knew what was going on with just a glance. Naturally, it was impossible for someone to keep an eye on you and watch you complete the tasks one by one. Instead, it was fine as long as one could produce the corresponding task proof. Since the task could be considered completed as long as one obtained the corresponding task proof, there were naturally some shortcuts. The innate Grand Luo cultivators who gathered around the application area were obviously those innate Grand Luo cultivators who wanted to take the shortcut. Of course, it wasn't really a shortcut. Strictly speaking, they were just helping each other out. Fellow Taoist, how many tasks have you completed? I have 30 task proofs here. If you have the proofs that I don't, I'm willing to exchange them with you. A few innate Grand Luo cultivators surrounded Taoist Yuan Zheng and greeted him. The other innate Grand Luo cultivators nodded and expressed their willingness to exchange as well. They would usually ask for more than one proof of completing a task. These proof of completing tasks could be exchanged with other cultivators' proof of completing tasks. They complemented each other and helped each other out. There's another way. Taoist Yuan Zheng was overjoyed when he heard that. Initially, he planned to see if there was any other way to enter the Tao Palace. If there wasn't, he would just forget about it. Now that he heard that he could exchange for the proof of completing tasks, he once again wanted to enter the Tao Palace through the normal way. Although the native cultivators were quite experienced and knowledgeable, they were still lacking compared to Taoist Yuan Zheng. However, compared to Taoist Yuan Zheng, there was still a huge disparity between them. Therefore, under Taoist Yuan Zheng's careful inquiry, he quickly found out all the information they knew. There were tens of thousands of tasks that needed to be completed to enter the Tao Palace. Each of the tasks would take a long time. On average, each of the tasks would take hundreds of years to complete. Because of this, ever since this standard was established, after so many years, this place had already become an industry that could complete missions. Many cultivators had actually entered the Tao Palace before, but they deliberately stayed here to resell the proof of completing tasks to the latecomers. Among the many cultivators here, only a small portion of them actually wanted to exchange for the proof of completing tasks to enter the Tao Palace. The rest were those who resold the proof of completing tasks. According to them, if one was really rich and overbearing, he would be able to collect at least 90% of the required proof of completing tasks here, which was enough to save a cultivator millions of years of time. As for the remaining 10% of the proof of completing tasks, it would depend on luck. Those tasks were more difficult to carry out, and it was even more difficult to obtain more than one proof of completing tasks. Therefore, such proof of completing tasks was relatively rare. Some of the tasks even required the executor of the task to personally complete them in order to obtain the proof. For these tasks, one would either have to pay a higher price to get the help of other cultivators to complete the first step, and one would have to complete the last step by himself, or one would have to complete the task bit by bit. In fact, it was precisely because of the existence of these tasks that the various sects did not clean up the trading place for the proof of completing tasks. If that was not the case, with how overbearing the various sects were, how could they allow these exchanges that broke the rules they had set up to appear? Given how intelligent Taoist Yuan Zheng was, he roughly understood that this was not the only reason why the trading place for the proof of completing tasks could be preserved. Perhaps there were still the figures of the various sects behind the trading place for the proof of completing tasks. After all, just by hearing about the various transactions, he already understood how great the benefits behind these transactions were. With such great benefits, he did not believe that the various sects would turn a blind eye to it. He even suspected that the tasks were not so numerous and difficult in the beginning, but that the various sects saw that there were benefits to be gained. So they cooperated and increased the number of tasks to such a high and difficult level. However, although he saw all this clearly, he did not take it seriously. With his experience, he naturally knew that these were simply unavoidable. Moreover, it had nothing to do with him. To him, it did not matter even if he had to pay a price that he could casually create, as long as he could save time and energy. Apart from other proof of completing tasks, the items needed to exchange for these proof of completing tasks were usually not physical objects. After all, when one reached the level of innate Grand Luo, it was easy for one to open up a world. No matter what item to create, one only needed to know the method to do so, and it was naturally not within the scope of discussion to create items that were beyond one's level. Any of those items were treasures of heaven and earth, but they would not be used for ordinary exchanges. Therefore, in general, The things that were exchanged for these proof of completing tasks were intangible existences, such as the cultivator's comprehension, the cultivator's divine ability, and the cultivator's cultivation method. But for Taoist Yuan Zheng, these were nothing. He did not even need to take out his own cultivation method, his comprehension, and his divine ability. He only needed to take out the cultivation methods, divine ability, and comprehension that existed in the cultivation world that he had opened up in the past, and it would be enough to exchange for everything in the entire trading place. In this way, to him, the entire trading center was basically a place where he could take whatever he wanted. Chapter 25:15. Even after experiencing the Tao Ancestors lecture, there was still a huge gap between the 999-story high pagoda continent and the great world of the outside world. The various inheritances here were thousands of times worse than any of the inheritances of rogue cultivators in the outside world, let alone those of the Tao masters in the outside world. Taoist Yuan Zheng, on the other hand, was an authentic cultivator who grew up in the great Tao master world. Even if he did not reveal his own inheritances and did not expose the various cultivation methods, divine abilities, and magic arts he had obtained in the great Tao master world. For all the cultivators from the outside world, the concepts and perspectives he had accumulated while growing up in the great Tao master world were enough to make them look up to him. With such concepts and perspectives, the various cultivation methods born in the great Tao master world that he had opened up in the past already carried a hint of charm from these concepts and perspectives. In this way, any of the magic arts he took out would faintly carry a mysterious feeling that he had not had enough of them. Naturally, they would become extremely precious. Therefore, after some cultivators obtained some magic arts from Taoist Yuan Zheng, he had already become the most popular existence in the entire trading place. All the cultivators were extremely looking forward to trading with him. They would even rather take out the mission certificates that they had originally decided not to trade with others, to trade with Taoist Yuan Zheng. In just a few days, Taoist Yuan Zheng had already collected more than 99% of the mission certificates that would have taken him millions of years to collect. In the end, there were only 23 mission certificates that he had yet to collect, and he could then enter the Tao Palace. Not a single one of these 23 mission certificates could be obtained on behalf of others. Each of them required Taoist Yuan Zheng to directly complete the corresponding tasks in the various places where missions were completed in order to obtain them. There were even a few that had to be handed over within a short period of time after obtaining them. Otherwise, the mission certificates would become invalid when the time limit was over. It was precisely because of this that he could not obtain these 23 mission certificates. If it were not for this, he would have become the fastest innate Zenith Heaven Realm cultivator to collect all the mission certificates since ancient times. However, even if he had to collect 23 mission certificates, it didn't mean that there was no other way. Seeing that Taoist Yuan Zheng was in a difficult position, a few cultivators carefully pulled him to the side, blocking him from the prying eyes and senses of others. Then, they said to Taoist Yuan Zheng, although fellow Taoist needs to personally handle the remaining tasks, we've actually come up with a way to speed up the progress of the tasks. If fellow Taoist is willing, we could get the other 18 fellow Taoists to help you. Upon hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng asked curiously how they could speed up the progress of the mission. After hundreds of millions of years, all of the tests and missions had already been thoroughly researched by many cultivators. Any mission could be divided into several steps, which were crucial, which were secondary, which could be done by someone else, and which had to be carried out by the person carrying out the mission. These were no secrets to the cultivators here. Although Taoist Yuan Zheng had to personally go to the 23 missions to obtain the mission certificate, he did not need to be present at every step of the way. As a matter of fact, he was only required to be present for 5 steps of each mission. Normal missions only required 1 or 2 steps, and he had to complete them personally. In this way, there was obviously a way to speed up the progress of the missions. They could set off at the same time with 23 people. There are 5 of them here, and they could get 18 more people to join them and activate the 23 missions at the same time. They would only ask Taoist Yuan Zheng to appear when the mission reached a step where he had to personally handle it. In this way, Although Taoist Yuan Zheng had to go to the 23 locations several times, he could compress the entire process of the mission into one mission. Roughly speaking, it would only take a few hundred years compared to the original time of several million years. It was obviously much shorter. Several hundred years seems a little long. Taoist Yuan Zheng muttered. Upon hearing this, the cultivator who spoke to him could not help but feel speechless. He looked at Taoist Yuan Zheng and could not help but criticize him in his heart. Several hundred years is considered long? Other innate zenith heaven cultivators would need millions of years to complete these missions. You're actually unwilling to pay for hundreds of years. However, Sir System was the one spending the money now. Since Taoist Yuan Zheng had raised his expectations, they could only propose a solution. At that moment, the few of them could only sigh and say, "We'll help you think of a solution, but you must give us a certain amount of compensation." Taoist Yuan Zheng had originally, he said it casually. Several hundred years was nothing to him. Although it was a waste to waste it on trying to enter the Taoist palace, he could still bear it. However, he did not expect that the other party could actually come up with a solution just by saying it casually. He could not help but be overjoyed and said, "As long as it's done quickly, you don't have to worry about the compensation." What was the compensation? It was just some divine abilities, magic incantations, and cultivation methods that appeared in the heaven and earth that he had opened up in the past. He had experienced the 4th level of the Tao Master's path, so naturally, he also had that group of worlds. Any of those worlds, and heaven and earth, could naturally give birth to countless cultivation methods, divine abilities, and magic incantations after countless years of accumulation. Therefore, even if the compensation was increased by 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 times to him, it was just a matter of collecting them with just a thought. It was not a big deal. These cultivators were naturally not worried that Taoist Yuan Zheng would not keep his promise. After all, not keeping his promise would not benefit him in any way. After all, those things that were extremely precious to them were nothing in the eyes of Taoist Yuan Zheng. Even if they gave him more, he would not suffer any loss. Therefore, at this time, they did not ask Taoist Yuan Zheng to give them any compensation in advance. They immediately shared the information with Taoist Yuan Zheng. Currently, the transactions of these 23 missions were still going on, but the target of the transactions was not Taoist Yuan Zheng. In this way, as long as Taoist Yuan Zheng was willing to pay, it would not be a difficult task to intercept these ongoing transactions. Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng could not help but be overjoyed. He said, "I see. So it's that simple. Thank you for your reminder, fellow Taoists. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I would have wasted hundreds of years." When the cultivators saw Taoist Yuan Zheng's sudden realization, they could only smile bitterly. One of them said, "Fellow Taoist, don't be too happy so soon. This actually depends on luck. If it's not a coincidence, there are a few missions that you don't need to participate in, and I'm afraid you'll have to wait for dozens of years." Hearing this, Taoist Yuan Zheng said with a smile, "Dozens of years it is. It's better than hundreds of years. However, I'm not familiar with these things, so I'll have to trouble you to contact them for me." As he spoke, he condensed a few balls of spiritual light and handed them to the 5 cultivators. These spiritual lights contained some cultivation methods, magic incantations, and divine abilities. Why were these 5 cultivators so attentively calling for Taoist Yuan Zheng? Was it not because of these spiritual lights? How could they be polite at such a time? They quickly agreed, took the spiritual lights, and examined them on the spot. When they clearly saw the various wonderful cultivation methods, magic incantations, and divine abilities, they were all very satisfied. Sure enough, the enlightenment Taoist Yuan Zheng gave them contained indescribable profoundness. Even though they had already reached a bottleneck, they could faintly feel that their bottleneck had loosened just by looking at it once. Nevertheless, they still had some professional ethics. Although they had already received their reward, they quickly composed themselves and kept the spiritual lights. After cupping their fists at Taoist Yuan Zheng, they began to busy themselves. Rays of spiritual lights were emitted from their bodies and flew to different parts of the world. Not long after, rays of spiritual light returned one after another and were caught by them. These spiritual lights were obviously the carriers that the cultivators used to communicate with each other. It meant that these cultivators were contacting other cultivators. As they retrieved the spiritual lights, these cultivators either frowned, relaxed, disappointed, or delighted. It was obvious that some answers made them happy, while others disappointed them. Next, after they identified the spiritual lights, they emitted more and more spiritual lights to contact the cultivators in other locations. This went on for a good few hours. Counting from the beginning, the number of fellow Taoists that these cultivators contacted should be at least tens of thousands of people. In the end, after they gathered and discussed, they came to a decision. After each of them emitted spiritual lights and received a reply, they went to see Taoist Yuanzhong. Fellow Taoist, we've contacted the fellow Taoists in 23 locations. As long as we advance according to our route and make 3 rounds, we should be able to complete all the tasks. Roughly speaking, it should take about 10 months, a few cultivators said to Taoist Yuanzhong. At this moment, they all looked rather happy. It was obvious that they had completed the tasks quite beautifully. Upon hearing this, Taoist Yuanzhong could not help but smile. He said, "Thank you, fellow Taoists. Let's begin." These cultivators did not mention to Taoist Yuanzhong about the rewards for the 23 cultivators. Previously, Taoist Yuanzhong had already made it clear that he was rich and overbearing. They believed that the rewards would definitely satisfy those cultivators. However, we still need to appease the fellow Taoists who issued the tasks, one of the cultivators said with a slightly embarrassed tone. Those 23 missions were currently intercepted from the hands of other cultivators. If this kind of interception halfway was not handled well, it was extremely likely that the intercepted cultivator would be dissatisfied. Therefore, for the sake of harmony, they still had to be appeased. No problem. Taoist Yuanzhong replied without a care in the world. After knowing that the magic art he casually took out was extremely valuable to the cultivators of this world, Taoist Yuanzhong no longer considered it a problem that could be solved by sacrificing these insights. When these cultivators saw this, they all heaved a sigh of relief. In fact, if Taoist Yuanzhong did not agree, there was nothing they could do. After all, Taoist Yuanzhong issued the tasks to them. If they wanted to receive the rewards, they naturally had to pay the price. Naturally, the dissatisfaction of the cultivators who issued the tasks had to be appeased by themselves. However, Taoist Yuanzhong had no obligation to help them appease them. It could be said that Taoist Yuanzhong had already given them quite a bit of face by accepting the task of appeasing them. Immediately, the few of them expressed their gratitude to Taoist Yuanzhong. Taoist Yuanzhong smiled and said, "All right, let's not waste any more time. Let's set off. Isn't the route already set?" Everyone nodded and immediately sent the route to Taoist Yuanzhong. It was a huge circle that went around the entire continent, going back and forth and going around the continent 3 or 4 times. It vaguely formed a strange encirclement. And the final destination was where the Taoist palace was located. Looking at the route, Taoist Yuanzhong knew that the 5 cultivators had already considered everything. This could be said to be the route that saved the most time and distance. At that moment, he nodded his head in satisfaction and flew up with the 5 of them. They quickly flew towards the first direction that the route had indicated. The 5 cultivators' estimation of the route was quite accurate, since they said it would take them 10 months, not a day more, not a day less. 10 months later, Taoist Yuanzhong and the 5 of them happened to return to the place where they applied for the qualification to enter the Taoist palace on the last day. The journey was quite smooth. Although the cultivators who were intercepted felt a little resentful towards Taoist Yuanzhong for interfering halfway, they could not wait for him to intercept them a few more times after being appeased by his rich and overbearing comprehension. In this way, they only spent the shortest amount of time in each position to complete the corresponding steps. As for the cultivators who went to help with the tasks, they were extremely happy with Taoist Yuanzhong's generosity. Each of them did their best, allowing Taoist Yuanzheng to complete the most troublesome processes in the easiest way possible. In the end, there were some tasks that Taoist Yuanzheng did not even know what was going on before the task certificates were issued. When they returned, the 5 cultivators looked at Taoist Yuanzheng with strong reluctance. During these 10 months, Taoist Yuanzheng would give them some comprehension from time to time. Although he did not give them a share of all the comprehensions he handed over, most of them were given a share. As a result, their unexpected gains over the past 10 months were several times more than their original rewards. Chapter 25:16. Taoist Yuanzheng could totally imagine how reluctant these cultivators were to part with him. However, he obviously did not care about their reluctance. Compared to other innate Grand Luo cultivators who spent millions of years to obtain the qualification to enter the Tao Palace, it was already unimaginably fast for him to obtain the qualification in just 10 months. However, for Taoist Yuanzheng, who merely wanted to enter the Tao Palace to take a look, spending 10 months to enter was already a relatively long time. If it wasn't for his cultivation realm being limited to the innate Grand Luo realm and the fact that he heard from the former 5th senior brother about how terrifying karma was, he would definitely not obediently waste these 10 months following the rules. Even if his cultivation realm was insufficient, even if the various sects had extremely tight defenses around the Tao Palace, he believed that as long as he was willing, he would be able to find a way to bypass their defenses and enter the Tao Palace. Under such circumstances, now that he was already qualified to enter the Tao Palace, how could he have the patience to act reluctantly to the other cultivators? At that moment, he just casually greeted them and directly entered the qualification application area with the many mission certificates to hand over the mission certificates to the cultivator who gave him the mission. So fast. Even though the cultivator who issued the mission had worked here for a long time and had seen hundreds of millions of innate Grand Luo cultivators, he was still surprised by Taoist Yuanzheng's speed. Normally, it was difficult to even find a way to complete a mission within 10 months. How could he not be surprised that Taoist Yuanzheng was able to complete so many missions within such a short period of time despite looking like a rookie? However, he was also experienced and knowledgeable. With just a little thought, he knew that the cultivator in front of him must be extremely wealthy. He must have spent the past 10 months wantonly to be able to make other cultivators help him wholeheartedly in such a short period of time. For a moment, he was filled with curiosity. However, although he was curious, the cultivator could only follow the normal procedure and obediently approved Taoist Yuanzheng's application to enter the Tao Palace. After all, although there were many obstacles set up to make it incredibly difficult for any innate Grand Luo cultivator to enter the Tao Palace, the various sects still cared about their reputation. Nevertheless, the various sects still cared about their reputation. Since the rules had been set up, they naturally had to follow them. If they didn't follow their rules, why would other cultivators follow their rules? Soon, Taoist Yuanzheng had obtained the certificate to enter the Doctrine Palace. It was a jade medallion that was covered in countless runes and restrictive spells. This jade token was not only the proof of entry and exit, but also the key to open the restriction. Without this jade token, even if he had the qualifications to enter the Tao Palace, he would definitely not be able to break through the surrounding restrictions and enter. Only by having the qualifications and the jade token would he be able to open the seals and prevent them from attacking him. Only then would he be able to safely break through the countless seals and enter the Doctrine Palace. The appearance of the jade token caused the surrounding cultivators to reveal looks of envy. To any cultivator, the Tao Palace was a sacred place for cultivation. Being able to enter the Tao Palace was a rare opportunity. It was even to the extent that some Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivators had directly broken through and become quasi-saints because they'd obtained the opportunity to enter the Tao Palace. Under such circumstances, any Khanate Golden Immortal Realm cultivator would not be indifferent to the Jade Token. Of course, the Jade Token was locked to one's identity. Even if they were extremely envious, no cultivator came forward to snatch the Jade Token. Even though Taoist Yuanzheng was the center of attention, He managed to reach the front of the Taoist palace unscathed and entered the countless restrictive spells and formations within. This jade token was enough to allow incarnate golden immortal realm cultivator to stay in the Tao Palace for millions of years. After that, the jade token would lose its effect. If the connate golden immortal realm cultivator had not broken through by then, he would be sent out of the Tao Palace by the surrounding restrictions. If he wanted to enter the Tao Palace again, he would have to complete the task again. Usually, the second task will be several times more difficult than the first. Normally, it would take millions of years to complete the first task. On the other hand, it would probably take millions of years to complete the second task. Spending millions of years to enter the Tao Palace was not considered extravagant for an ordinary connate golden immortal realm cultivator. However, it was obviously extravagant to spend millions of years to enter a place that had already been entered once. After all, one could not break through the bottleneck between the connate golden immortal realm and the safe-to-be realm after millions of years in the Tao Palace. So what if one entered for millions of years again? The chances of breaking through were obviously not high. In that case, it was obviously not worth it to spend millions of years chasing after such an opportunity. Ordinary cultivators would rather spend time searching for the second level of the continent than waste time on this. Therefore, very few people completed the second task of entering the Tao Palace. Usually, there would not be one in millions of years. However, this had nothing to do with Taoist Yuanzhang at all. He would never enter the Tao Palace for the second time. When he entered the countless restrictions and formations around the Tao Palace, the jade token in his hand released a lustrous brilliance that enveloped him. When the power of the countless restrictions and formations flooded toward him, it was blocked by the lustrous brilliance. It only stirred up some ripples on the lustrous brilliance, but it did not cause any damage to the lustrous brilliance. As for himself, he did not feel any pressure because of this. Then, some invisible force drove the lustrous brilliance, allowing him to keep moving forward. After an unknown period of time, he was brought into the Tao Palace and saw an incomparably vast world. He could feel the boundless Tao that filled the Tao Palace. The lustrous brilliance that brought him in instantly disappeared and turned back into a jade token. However, Taoist Yuanzhang could clearly feel that the jade token was being worn away by some strange power every moment. At every moment, some indescribable loss appeared on the jade token. However, the wear and loss was extremely slow. Based on the speed, it would take at least millions of years before it would be completely worn away. Looking at the jade token, Taoist Yuanzhang's heart skipped a beat, and he had the urge to crush it. After all, after passing through the restriction and formation once, he had already completely understood how the restriction and formation operated. Although he did not fully understand all the mysteries within, he already had a way to bypass its power and easily enter and exit the formations and restrictions. Under such circumstances, whether the jade token existed or not was meaningless to him. However, he stopped at the last moment. It's meaningless at all. I'll just keep it. I don't want those sects to find out that something is wrong with the jade token if they have any means to check it. It did not matter to him whether he had the jade token or not. Since that was the case, it was naturally not necessary to crush the jade token. After putting the jade token away, Taoist Yuanzhang glanced at the Taoist palace. Amidst the infinite Tao will, there were many small spaces. These small spaces were extremely mysterious. They seemed to be completely independent from each other, but they were also vaguely connected, forming a strange whole. They were distributed throughout the entire Taoist palace. At first glance, it seemed as if there was nothing there, but upon closer inspection, it was like a sky full of stars. Among the countless small spaces, he could sense the existence of the aura of living beings in a small part of them. These auras varied in strength, and the stronger ones were even at the false saint realm. The weaker ones were merely innate grand luo. However, they were generally similar to the current him. Obviously, these living beings were the cultivators who entered the Taoist palace to cultivate. There are so many empty spaces, but the outside world restricts the entry of cultivators. What a waste. Looking at this scene, Taoist Yuan Zheng could not help but sigh inwardly. One must know that the number of small spaces in the Taoist palace was even more than the number of innate grand luo cultivators on the first floor. Even if the Taoist palace were to completely open up and allow all innate grand luo cultivators to enter, there would still be more than enough space. However, now that the small spaces were completely empty, the innate grand luo cultivators outside could not enter even if they wanted to. No matter how he looked at it, it was a waste. Sighing inwardly, Taoist Yuan Zheng stepped into a small space beside him. The moment he stepped into it, he felt the world spin, and in the blink of an eye, he seemed to have arrived at another Taoist palace. A Taoist palace from an unknown period of time. A Taoist ancestor was preaching about Tao, and many disciples of the Taoist ancestor were listening to him. Mysterious voices were constantly transmitted into Taoist Yuan Zheng's ears, causing him to feel his body trembling slightly. He could feel his power and life essence constantly improving. Unknowingly, his cultivation realm had already come into contact with the bottleneck between the innate grand luo and the sage-to-be realm. Moreover, this bottleneck seemed extremely fragile, as if he could break through the bottleneck in the next moment and become a sage-to-be under the influence of the voices. How is this possible? At this moment, Taoist Yuan Zheng could not help but be shocked. From what he could hear, the content of the Taoist ancestor's lecture was nothing special, and there were even countless omissions that he could find. Any bit of his own understanding could even easily suppress the content of the sermon. However, under such circumstances, under the influence of the voices, his cultivation realm could actually improve so greatly and rapidly. No matter how he looked at it, it was an incredible thing. As a five tribulation expert by nature, it was impossible for him to accept such an incredible thing so easily. He suppressed his urge to break through and carefully sensed all the changes that happened to his body, as well as the various mysteries contained in the voices. He wanted to figure out what was going on and whether it was a good thing or a bad thing for him. After all, he was a five tribulation expert by nature. After carefully experiencing it for hundreds of years, Taoist Yuan Zheng finally grasped the key point. Karma. This is forming karma. On this day, Taoist Yuan Zheng's body trembled as he suddenly woke up from his state of research and murmured. In that instant, he instinctively turned around and left the small space, returning to the hall where he first came from. At this moment, the perspective in his eyes had changed. How could it be countless small spaces? It was simply a mass of karma. Entering the small space was actually entering the mass of karma. Any understanding in the small space was to obtain some kind of invisible and mysterious existence from the karma to help oneself improve. The greater the improvement, the deeper the connection between the karma and the karma. This kind of connection was nothing to the indigenous cultivators. After all, the karma between the indigenous cultivators and this continent was so deep that it was inseparable. Under such circumstances, the additional karma was nothing to them. If this continent really wanted to be calculative with them, the original karma alone was enough to make them unable to reincarnate. Naturally, the additional karma would not affect the overall situation. However, if the continent didn't bother with them, they wouldn't even care about the heavy karma. Why would they care about the little bit of karma that was added here? However, the situation was completely different for Taoist Yuan Zheng, who was an outsider. Taoist Yuan Zheng himself had no karma with this continent. It could even be said that this continent owed him some karma. After all, ever since he entered this continent, Taoist Yuan Zheng did not absorb anything from this continent, whether it was his power or his understanding. On the contrary, he gave some of his understanding, some magic arts, and some divine abilities to the cultivators on this continent. If he extended them, it would be equivalent to handing over the continent. Under such circumstances, this continent would instead owe him some karma. Although it was not much, it was still a debt. This and the karma he owed this continent were two completely different situations. Under such circumstances, if Taoist Yuan Zheng were to absorb the karma in the Tao Palace, the karma that the mainland owed him would naturally be canceled out, and he would owe the mainland more and more karma. Thinking of this, Taoist Yuan Zheng could not help but feel terrified. With the previous fifth senior brother as an example, how could he accept this continent's karma so carelessly? I can't absorb any understanding from this continent. Once I do, I'll form a deep karma. Only by improving myself bit by bit with my own understanding can I avoid the entanglement of karma and finally transcend. Taoist Yuan Zheng instantly made up his mind. Chapter 25:17. Fellow Taoist, did you gain anything? Just as Taoist Yuan Zheng was about to leave the Doctrine Palace, a voice suddenly reached his ears. Taoist Yuan Zheng knew it was the voice of the former fifth senior brother. He could hear a faint expectation in the voice, as well as an inexplicable complex emotion. Taoist Yuan Zheng sighed and said, "Gain? I only saw through some of the essence and learned some of the limitations. Strictly speaking, this is a pretty good harvest." The former fifth senior brother sighed helplessly and said, "It seems that fellow Taoist is no exception. The karma on this continent is so heavy that outsiders can't cultivate on this continent at all." Taoist Yuan Zheng shook his head and said, "It's definitely possible. It's just that we haven't come up with any ideas yet. I don't believe that the ruler of the Forbidden Land would leave such a big loophole." The former fifth senior brother wanted to refute Taoist Yuan's words. However, he had already received Luo Fan's hospitality before. At this time, he knew that if he were to say these words, he was afraid that there would be a more severe punishment falling on his head. How could he dare to say those words out loud? He just shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, if you're free, you can come and sit by yourself." Taoist Yuan Zheng just smiled and said, "It's fine. I just have some ideas and want to test them out, so I won't disturb you." As he spoke, he no longer paid any attention to the former fifth senior brother. He turned into a light and flew toward a strange place in the northwest corner of this continent. He was a connate zenith heaven cultivator, which was nothing in this continent. But no matter what, he was a self-sufficient existence. For him, even if he completely ignored the influence of the outside world, the help from the outside world would not affect him at all. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to avoid affecting everything on this continent, he naturally had to choose a place that could avoid all the intertwining factors on this continent. In other words, the cultivation place he was going to choose was definitely not the holy land of cultivation on this continent. Instead, it must be a barren land where the essence of the world was cut off. Only in such a place would he be able to prevent the karmic connection between him and this continent from becoming even stronger. Only then would he be able to use the best and fastest method to raise his cultivation level. The northwest corner of this continent was the barren mountains and unruly rivers that he had seen before. Here, within a radius of billions of kilometers, there were only ordinary beasts and living creatures. There were no extraordinary creatures or even extraordinary objects. In fact, the center of the area had turned into a place of loathing. Any vital energy of heaven and earth, any extraordinary power, even air and life force, were all repelled. Even though Taoist Yuan Zheng had expected this, he still felt uncomfortable in such a place. In order to avoid karma, I can only choose such a place. He sighed, and with a flash of light, he landed on the land of loathsome spirits. He stopped right there. This spirit-loathing land was not created by any treasure or demonic creature. It was the natural landscape of this continent. It was the inevitable result of the circulation of the rules and laws on this continent. Therefore, the rejection and discomfort he felt in this place all came from this region itself. There was no source. When he arrived here, Taoist Yuan Zheng's heart jolted slightly. He felt that the karmic connection between him and this continent seemed to have weakened a lot. Although it still existed, it was not like before, where every breath seemed to deepen the karmic connection between him and this continent. Looks like I made the right choice in choosing this place. With this thought in mind, he moved and opened up his inner world. Endless energy and matter began to gush out, constantly outlining and constructing the interior of this spirit-loathing land. In the blink of an eye, it had already turned into a cave dwelling. All the matter and energy in this cave dwelling were created by Taoist Yuanzhang. Not a single bit of it was taken from this continent. When this change occurred, he once again felt that the karmic connection between him and this continent seemed to have weakened again. However, the amount of weakening was insignificant. If he wanted to rely on this method to cut off all the karmic connections, it would probably take an endless amount of time. With this thought in mind, Taoist Yuanzhang stopped what he was doing and directly went into the cave dwelling he created. He began to sit cross-legged and close his eyes. He began to operate the power in his body to improve himself. After entering this continent, everything about him was suppressed. Even if there were remnants of his past memories, his past cultivation achievements had all disappeared without a trace. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to improve himself and achieve a breakthrough, he could only cultivate from nothing. He had to climb up bit by bit and break through the bottleneck bit by bit. Only then could he advance his cultivation realm. Therefore, although his cultivation at this time was much easier than that of ordinary innate Grand Luo cultivators, because he possessed the memories of a fifth tribulation expert, he could not improve his realm to an unbelievable level in just a moment. This was especially so when he was completely unable to gain enlightenment from the world outside his own body at this time. It's not difficult to break through to the innate Grand Luo. It's easy for me to reach the sage-to-be, false saint, or even false saint level. However, it'll be troublesome if I go further. Taoist Yuanzhang frowned deeply as he pondered. With his own comprehension, he was confident that he could easily break through the sage-to-be, false saint, and false saint realms. However, there was a key to becoming a false saint. He had to first attach himself to the world before transcending it. Although attaching himself to the world was not difficult for him, attaching himself to the world required him to become one with it. This kind of integration was obviously the greatest karmic connection. Even if he didn't need the help of heaven and earth before this, and didn't ask for anything from heaven and earth, as long as he wanted to fuse with heaven and earth, then the karma would be enough to lock him in the false sage realm, and he wouldn't be able to transcend. It's impossible to cultivate in seclusion. Moreover, the false saint, desperado, and supreme emperor realms can still rely on accumulation to improve themselves. However, the higher realms would require the help of the environment to advance. Without the environment, even if I have the cultivation comprehension in the past, it's nothing more than a flower in the mirror and the moon in the water. In this case, it's even more impossible for me to leave this continent, this world. Then, he became even more distressed. The previous false saint realm only allowed him to become one with the world. After stepping into the tribulation realm, his cultivation would completely need to become one with the world. If he did not become one with the world, it would be impossible for him to improve, even if he had countless cultivation comprehension. Not to mention other things, the world cluster of the fourth tribulation powerhouses could only be formed by working together with the outside world. Without the help of the outside world, no matter how much comprehension he had, this world cluster would just be a bubble. It was impossible to condense it. The world cluster of the fourth tribulation powerhouses was the most obvious. The other levels also had corresponding changes that required the help of the outside world. Without the corresponding environment, these were all illusory. Therefore, cultivating in seclusion and relying on his own comprehension was full of obstacles. And in the end, it was impossible for him to succeed. I'll first raise my realm to the peak of the false saint realm. The current innate grand heavenly realm is just too weak. Taoist Tianzhang's last thought flashed through his mind. Then, all the distracting thoughts were completely eliminated. To the current him, the realms before the false saint realm were just a matter of time. As long as he had enough time, even if he did not seek external help, he would be able to break through and cross over. Only when he reached the false saint realm would he be inseparable from the outside world. Only then would he need to have unavoidable karma entanglement with the outside world. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not need to think too much about what would happen after the false saint realm. He only needed to walk on the path that he could before anything else. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of millions of years had passed. In the northwest corner of the continent, the land of loathsome spirits had unknowingly turned into a spiritual core after hundreds of millions of years of development. Boundless spiritual vigor, vitality, and the world's origin chi were constantly gushing out from the cave abode in the center and pouring into the continent. Over the past hundreds of millions of years, the various energies, vitality, and spiritual vigor that gushed out were even enough to nurture hundreds of millions of innate grand heavenly realm cultivators from nothing to success. However, even so, the spiritual vigor, energy, and vitality that gushed out were still insignificant compared to the continent. In fact, they could even be neglected if one was not careful. On this day, in the cave abode in the land of loathsome spirits, a strange celestial sound suddenly rang out. Amidst the celestial sound, the northwest corner of the continent was enveloped in an indescribable joy. All living beings naturally felt a sense of joy from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if the greatest wish in their dreams had suddenly been fulfilled. At the same time, the countless ordinary living beings also suddenly received spiritual vigor. From their original appearance of ordinary living beings, they obtained a little extraordinary power, and their intelligence was greatly elevated. This was obviously because the celestial sound contained a wonderful power that was equivalent to an enlightening power that gave them an enlightening effect. I finally reached the peak of the false saint great path. At this moment, Taoist Yuan Zheng's extremely joyful exclamation was heard from the cave abode. As he was exclaiming, a massive and unparalleled aura began to sweep in all directions, quickly sweeping through the entire continent. An inexplicable sense of rejection appeared in Taoist Yuan Zheng's heart at this moment. It was as if some kind of invisible consciousness was urging him to leave this continent. In fact, even the aura he released was faintly suppressed at this moment. The further he spread his aura, the stronger the suppression became. In the end, he even felt as if he was moving through a swamp, and it was difficult to move even an inch. There are not many powerhouses on the first level of the continent to begin with. The strongest among them was only at the false saint realm. Under such circumstances, as an existence at the peak of the false saint realm, it was not difficult for his aura to envelop the entire continent, so it was not difficult for the continent to hide any secrets from him. However, at this moment, his aura at the peak of the false saint realm had only enveloped a little bit of the northwest corner. Apart from that, it was difficult for it to spread further. It was as if the world was suppressing and restricting him. This continent can't accommodate me anymore. Taoist Yuan Zheng was surprised. His heart skipped a beat, and the perspective in his eyes began to change from a normal perspective to a karma perspective. At a glance, the entire continent had been completely formed by a combination of karma. Endless karma appeared in his eyes at this moment. In his eyes, apart from himself, there was a mass of karma that was the heaviest on this continent. He felt that the karma of the entire continent had turned into a chain that was tightly wrapped around that mass of karma. And the source of the karma was none other than the location of the former fifth senior brother. Obviously, even after hundreds of millions of years had passed, and the former fifth senior brother had worked hard for such a long time, the karma between him and this continent was still so heavy and could not be eliminated. Apart from him, the karma of other people varied in size, but none of them were bound by the karma of the entire continent like the former fifth senior brother's karma. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look at himself. As he shifted his gaze, he saw that the karma on him was equally heavy. However, it was not the karma of the continent that was binding him. On the contrary, it was his karma that was constantly penetrating deep into the continent. With one look, he knew what was going on. Over the past hundreds of millions of years, he had not taken anything from this continent. On the contrary, he had sent a large amount of energy, spiritual opportunity, vitality, and materials to this continent. Unknowingly, this continent owed him a large amount of karma. Of course, this karma was obviously insignificant compared to this continent. However, compared to himself, this karma was already quite heavy. In fact, the sense of rejection he felt at this moment was because this continent was rejecting him due to the large amount of karma it owed him. In other words, this continent felt that it could not repay the karma it owed him. So it wanted to expel him from this continent and make him disappear with this karma.